Jaime Lannister felt the cold press of steel against his neck and realized he had miscalculated. It was not an admission he made easily or often. The exchange with Locke and his men had gone poorly, and now he was surrounded by hostile stares. Brienne of Tarth stood nearby, her posture stiff with anger, her face smeared with dirt and half hidden beneath disheveled golden hair. She tried to keep her own blade up, but every time she moved, more of Locke's men slid in to counter her. And there Jaime stood, wrists bound, a knife inches from his throat, no one moving, all braced for violence. He had been a prisoner long enough to learn that hope was fleeting. He had, at times, conjured fantasies of rescue or easy escape, only to crush them down with the same cynicism that had kept him alive this long. But this time, there was something else stirring inside him, an anger that his arrogance might have led him to a final misstep. He was not ready to die. Not here, not in the mud, and certainly not for the amusement of these curs. He was Jaime Lannister, and though he often wore his honor like a tattered cloak, sloughed on and off at convenience, he would not allow himself to be butchered so unceremoniously. Locke approached with a mocking smirk, trying to goad him. "You're the famous Kingslayer," he said, voice loud enough for his men to hear and revel in the moment. "I've heard you can sing a different tune when you lose what you value most." Jaime recognized the threat. In another turning of fate, he'd have felt the blade bite into his wrist, and the next moments would spiral into the darkest period of his life. But something happened. Perhaps it was the tension of the men, perhaps the sudden shift of Brienne's stance. A distraction. As Locke's blade inched nearer to Jaime's wrist, seeking to cripple the swordsman known throughout the Seven Kingdoms, Brienne bellowed out a curse, feinted a charge, and in that heartbeat, Jaime twisted, threw himself at Locke, and for a breath of time the grip on him loosened. A clang of swords, a shout of pain, and Jaime was free from the knife's immediate threat. He might have died then, had Locke not been forced to whirl around to fend off Brienne's blade. Freed for an instant, Jaime dove into the fray, wrestling with one of the men. He was still bound at the wrists, but desperation can breed unexpected strength. His shoulder rammed the man's face, cracking bone and flesh, and Jaime's knee found a groin. The soldier folded, coughing, weapon dropping into the muck. Jaime struggled to get hold of it, but the ropes cut into his flesh, and it was awkward as hell. Brienne seized the moment to fight with savage precision. She clove a path through two of Locke's men, giving Jaime the space he needed. Another mercenary lunged at her, but she caught him with a backhand swing. Jaime saw an opening, rolled, and managed to free his wrists on the discarded knife. The bonds snapped, painful but freeing. He caught a short sword that tumbled from a dying foe's hands. At last, steel in hand again. Locke cursed, calling for his men to regroup, but their numbers were thin now, and they were uncertain in the face of the ferocity of the two. Jaime's heart pounded. There was a ringing in his ears that had nothing to do with the clamor of blades. He swung at the first man to come within range, severing a spear shaft, then pivoted to drive his elbow into another's face. The man yowled, stumbling back. Locke tried to close in, brandishing his own sword in a swirl of motion. Brienne lurched aside, and Jaime parried, stepping between them with the fluid grace of a born sword fighter. Pain flared up his side, but the adrenaline pushed it away. For a heartbeat, Jaime thought he could truly die here if he erred. One misstep, and a sword or spear would pierce him. But he fell back on training, years of sparring with the best in the realm, and even as Locke closed, Jaime snapped up his own blade and deflected the blow, teeth gritted. Locke's eyes widened in recognition of Jaime's skill. An insult hung on his lips, but before he could spit it, Jaime stepped in, knocked aside Locke's second strike, and seized the moment to slash him across the collarbone. Locke staggered, red blossoming across his tunic, and his men wavered. Brienne struck again, her broad blade smashing another to the ground. Jaime, chest heaving, stared at Locke, who dropped to a knee, pressing a hand to his wound. Silence fell among the survivors. The confrontation was decided. Locke, in ragged breath, spat at Jaime's feet. "You'll not get far," he groaned. though his strength was ebbing. Jaime's voice was cold, commanding that same sense of final authority he once held at the height of his power. "We'll go as far as we wish. I advise you to crawl back to whichever gutter you came from before I decide I want your head." Locke's men, those still able, gathered him up. None dared to meet Jaime's eyes. Some cursed under their breath, others simply stared, knowing the advantage was lost. Within moments, they were hobbling away, a few throwing hateful glances over their shoulders. In a heartbeat, it was done. Jaime felt a faint tremor in his arm, the reflexive shock of near death. He clutched the sword more tightly. Brienne stood rigid, her eyes scanning for further threats. The damp wind rustled the trees overhead, but there was no more movement aside from the slow crawl of the wounded. At last, Brienne turned to Jaime and demanded, "Are you all right?" He exhaled slowly, letting the tension ebb. "I'll manage," he said, refusing to show how unnerved he was at his brush with losing a hand, and likely his life. His gaze fell on the ropes that lay severed on the ground. That had nearly been the moment. He thought of how differently the day would have gone had the blade come down on his wrist. The entire shape of him, his identity, was tied to that sword hand. To lose it would be to become something else entirely, something lesser. Jaime's pride might not have withstood it. Brienne noticed his look, and her own features softened for just an instant. Perhaps she was thinking the same thing. "You were nearly undone," she said quietly. He responded with a short laugh, though it rang hollow. "Nearly is not undone, my lady." She pressed her lips together. As though there were words on her tongue, she was reluctant to speak. Then she sheathed her sword in a single, practiced movement. "We should move. There could be more of them." So together they trudged onward. The encounter with Locke's men would always linger as a grim memory. But now it was a memory of survival, not mutilation. Jaime's hand was still intact, and in the hours and days to come, that detail would shape everything else that followed. The journey southward was no less harrowing, but Jaime was keenly aware of the life still in his fingers. Occasionally, he would open and close his hand just to affirm that it remained. Brienne noticed, though she offered no comment. She was as stoic as ever, forging ahead, determined to protect Lady Catelyn Stark's investment in Jaime's safe return or exchange. She was still sworn to bring him to King's Landing in hopes of retrieving the Stark daughters. But unspoken in each glance they shared was the memory that Locke would have robbed them of this uneasy partnership if not for that sudden turn of chance. They found refuge one night in a half-collapsed barn near a seldom-traveled road. A cold wind howled as Brienne started a small fire. Jaime sat across from her, arms draped over his knees. He studied her in the flickering light, her broad shoulders, the set of her jaw. She was a warrior to her core, no lesser than the knights he'd trained with in his youth. He respected her prowess, though he wouldn't always admit it aloud. "You're not quite as useless as you first seemed," he said, half mocking. She glared. "Nor you as dangerous, if you need me to save you every time we cross swords with brigands." He gave a faint chuckle. "You saved me? My memory seems hazy on that point. But I do recall you bellowing like some she-bear and distracting them. So perhaps there's gratitude in order." She sighed, stoking the fire. "You were arrogant. You tried to bribe Locke's men. You nearly lost your life." Jaime turned his gaze to the dancing flames. "A Lannister pays his debts, so I thought I might spare us both trouble." She didn't answer. The silence hung between them until Jaime found himself absently flexing his hand again. She noticed, and something softened in her face. "You should be grateful for it," she murmured. "Your sword hand. If you lost it—" He cut her off more brusquely than he intended. "I didn't." She looked away, letting the subject drop. Somewhere outside the barn, the wind picked up, blowing in from the north. Jaime felt the chill seeping through cracks in the walls. He realized, not for the first time, that he owed Brienne far more than he was comfortable admitting. Pride and gratitude warred within him, so he said nothing more, letting the firelight and the hush lull them into an uneasy rest. By the time they crossed into the Riverlands, Jaime found his old confidence returning. There was a shift in his bearing, in the way he spoke, He was the Kingslayer still, but the feeling of humiliation that had clung to him during captivity and transport was starting to erode. Brienne remained vigilant, but she could not entirely keep Jaime from indulging the arrogance that had defined him for so long. He would ride with his chin high, scanning the horizon as though every village or holdfast was beneath him. Yet it was impossible not to notice that the war had touched the land. Farms lay burned or abandoned. Flocks of ravens circled in the sky. Villagers, if they were found at all, eyed travelers with fear and mistrust. Once, they came upon a roadside with corpses hanging from a tall oak, the grim remains of outlaws or perhaps innocents. Jaime felt no pang of sympathy, but Brienne's lips pressed into a thin line. War was as it always was, he thought, harsh, ugly, necessary. Yet he couldn't shake a sense that everything was spinning farther out of control than even he realized. Tywin Lannister might have the cunning and the soldiers to shape the conflict, but the realm was splintered, battered, and perhaps on the brink of something worse. They skirted the edges of Riverrun's territory, eventually finding that the Tullus had fortified themselves. Rumors spoke of Robb Stark still riding about, though how far his fortunes had fallen since the early days was uncertain. Jaime heard conflicting tales. Some said the young wolf was still undefeated in battle. Others insisted the Lannisters had forced him into retreat. None of it mattered to Jaime if he could reach King's Landing and be done with this business. The only thing that annoyed him was hearing the name of the young wolf at all. That boy had humiliated him, after all, capturing him in the Whispering Wood. Jaime longed for retribution in some form. One morning, as they were packing up their scant belongings, a pair of peasants stumbled across them. A man and a woman, the latter cradling an infant. They were frightened at the sight of two armed strangers. The man muttered something about the war, about bandits and sellswords. Brienne had softened enough to offer them some bread from her stores. Jaime would have sent them on their way, but he found himself idly curious. Which lords hold these lands now? The man hesitated, glancing at the woman, then answered, Lannister soldiers, lord, but also sellswords from the twins, and outlaws too. It's the same from the trident to the neck. No one knows who truly holds any land anymore. Jaime flicked his gaze to Brienne, who listened intently. And the Stark boy? Where does he roam? The peasant paled as if speaking the name was dangerous. I've heard he's marched west. Some say to the neck to face the Ironborn. Others say he's parted from the Freys. No one knows for sure. He gestured to the child. We've heard rumors the Freys plan something big. Some wedding feasts up at the twins. The roads aren't safe. Brienne thanked them, pressing another bit of bread into the woman's hands. They hurried away, leaving Jaime to muse. A wedding feast at the twins. That would be Walder Frey's domain. He remembered the old man's countless brood. Something in the rumors gave him pause. He knew too well how alliances might shift at a moment's notice. Walder Frey was no less cunning than many a lord, and if the Starks had offended him, or if the Lannisters had found some way to turn him, all of it was speculation, but Jaime recognized the shape of possibility. His father was adept at forging new alliances, especially with houses that felt slighted or overlooked. Brienne's voice drew him from his thoughts. We should press on. He nodded. His mind churned. If the Lannisters were weaving a web around the Starks at the twins, it meant Sansa and Arya Stark's safety might be even more precarious. He recalled his promise to Catelyn Stark, or rather, the promise she forced out of him, that he would ensure her daughter's return if she released him. He had made the vow with more intention of regaining his own freedom than anything else, but he also had no wish to see the girls dead. If they were a bargaining chip, it was best to keep them breathing. They pushed onward. At King's Landing, the atmosphere was tense. Rumors of Stannis Baratheon's defeat at the Blackwater still reverberated, but the city was uneasy. Cersei Lannister had tried to keep control. Marjorie Tyrell was making inroads at court with her beauty and charm. Joffrey, the boy king, presided over it all with the arrogance of youth and a cruelty nurtured by his mother. Tywin Lannister, the true power behind the throne, had installed himself as Hand of the King. The Tyrell alliance was of enormous strategic importance. and so the Lannisters strove to preserve it while continuing to crush the remnants of Robb Stark's rebellion. Into this mix arrived Jaime Lannister, very much alive, unmaimed, in the company of Brienne of Tarth. They found themselves the subject of a flurry of whispers the moment they passed through the city gates. The gold cloaks recognized Jaime at once, saluting him. The first sight of him astride a horse, glimmering in battered armor, golden hair spilling to his shoulders, stirred awe and relief among Lannister loyalists. He was a symbol of the family's martial prowess, the best swordsman in the land, the hero who slew the Mad King, though behind his back, some muttered Kingslayer in a tone of derision. Word of his arrival spread fast. In no time, a royal escort came to guide him to the Red Keep. Jaime dismounted in the yard, ignoring the stable boys who rushed to tend his horse, and looked up at the high walls that enclosed him. In that moment, he felt something like triumph. He had survived captivity, avoided mutilation, and returned to where he held power. Indeed, he still had his sword hand, and that meant the rest of the realm would see him as the formidable warrior he'd always been. Brienne slid off her horse more cautiously, glaring at the stairs directed her way. She was a stranger in this lion's den, but she followed Jaime, for she had her own mission: fulfill Catelyn's demand to see the Stark girls safely exchanged. If Sansa was still in King's Landing, or so rumor said, then Brienne intended to ensure her welfare if she could. They were escorted straight into the presence of Tywin, who sat in the Hall of the Hand, surrounded by courtiers and advisors. When Jaime and Brienne entered, a hush fell. Tywin rose, something like approval flickering over his stern features. Cersei stood at his side, clad in the rich crimson and gold of House Lannister, her hair coiled. Jaime's heart skipped at the sight of her, that illicit bond they shared a secret from most. She drank him in with her green eyes, a mixture of relief and anger. Tyrion was there as well, the imp watching with curiosity. "Jaime," Cersei said, stepping forward. In a more private place, she might have embraced him fiercely. Here, however, she only placed a hand on his arm, letting her eyes say the rest. "You're alive." He gave a short bow. "We had some trouble, but I managed." Tywin's voice cut across the hall. "Welcome home, son. You appear none the worse for your journey." He let his cool gaze flick to Brienne. "You've brought a companion." Jaime gestured to her. "Brienne of Tarth. She was charged by Lady Catelyn Stark to see me safely returned in exchange for Sansa and Arya Stark. Which begs the question, do we still hold them both?" There was an awkward pause. Tyrion coughed, stepped forward. "We hold Sansa, but the younger girl has gone missing. We believe Arya Stark escaped during the chaos of the war." Jaime's lips tightened. He glanced at Brienne, whose face clouded. The entire arrangement hinged on both girls. But Jaime was pragmatic. "Then Sansa remains, which may serve well enough for now." Tywin inclined his head. "Her betrothal to Joffrey stands, at least for the moment. The Tyrells are keen to see Margaery wed to the king, so the Stark girl's future is uncertain." Brienne bristled. Lady Catelyn wanted her daughters safe from harm. The girl is not a pawn to be trifled with. A hush fell at her boldness. Tywin studied her like one might an insect. "In war, all are pawns, my lady. Your part in returning my son is commendable. We'll see to your lodging, though the matter of Sansa Stark is not solely yours to decide." Jaime gave Brienne a warning look before turning back to his father. "Lord Tywin," Lady Brienne upheld her end of the bargain. "I trust we'll treat her with the respect she's earned." His tone was more formal than usual, shaped by the presence of onlookers. Tywin gave a dismissive nod, but said nothing further on the matter. Cersei interjected. "We're in the midst of delicate negotiations, Jaime. The Tyrells are proving themselves useful allies, but their ambitions are large." Her eyes flicked to Brienne, then back to Jaime. "We should speak privately." Tywin, as though reading the tension, beckoned for an end to the public greeting. "Yes, Jaime, rest, recuperate. You'll have your place on the Kingsguard back, though we'll have to see how best to handle the political ramifications of your captivity." He eyed Jaime's still whole sword hand, as though verifying it truly remained. "I'll expect a full report, but for now, get some rest." With that, the hall was dismissed, and Jaime allowed himself a small exhale. The entire exchange was typical Lannister. Cold, formal, overshadowed by underlying tensions. At least he was back, and no one was brandishing a red-hot blade at his wrist. Cersei and Jaime found themselves alone in her private chambers, the afternoon sun streaming through a high window. Outside, the city teemed with life, the warm air carrying the buzz of rumor about the Kingslayer's return. Inside, the hush was thick. Cersei reached for his hand, the same hand that had been inches away from ruin. She traced her fingers over his knuckles, as though she couldn't quite believe it was all still there. "Jaime, I heard such terrible stories, that you were maimed, disfigured." He gave a wry smile. "Those rumors weren't far from truth. I narrowly avoided it, thanks to Brienne. It was a close thing." Her eyes flashed. "I'll see that man lock flayed if ever he sets foot near King's Landing. No one threatens a Lannister." Jaime squeezed her hand gently. A wave of familiarity coursed through him. This was Cersei, the woman he'd known intimately all his life, the mother of his children, the queen, for better or worse. "It's done, but I can still. I'll fight, and I intend to. We can put an end to this war now that I'm back." She released his hand, paced to the window. "Father plans something, you know. He's always plotting. Whatever alliances are forged, Sansa Stark's role is to be decided. She's a child, but Father sees her as a key to the North. Joffrey's betrothal to her was never more than a temporary measure. Now Marjorie Tyrell has replaced her in his eyes, and Sansa is something of an afterthought." He thought of Brienne's vow, a complicated puzzle, but ultimately Jaime's loyalty was to his family, which overshadowed any vow forced upon him. Still, he felt a twinge of something, call it conscience or curiosity. He was different since captivity, if only slightly. Is the Stark girl being mistreated? Cersei shrugged. She's a hostage. She lives well enough, food, clothes, courtesy. But she's not free. Jaime mulled it over. We might arrange an exchange. It would please the Tullus, might speed an end to the war. Unless Father wishes to keep the fighting going. She eyed him suspiciously. You're quite eager to see the girl freed. He lifted a shoulder. The sooner this war ends, the sooner we secure our power. The realm bleeds. Father has no interest in letting the North remain rebellious. If we can use the girl as a bargaining chip, we will. If not, well, he let it hang. The meaning was clear. Sansa was a piece on the board, to be moved or sacrificed as Tywin saw fit. Cersei nodded, satisfied. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. I want you at Joffrey's side, Jaime. Marjorie Tyrell's presence is unsettling at times. She bewitches him with flattery. I need someone loyal to me, loyal to our house, watching him. He looked at her steadily. Of course, I am his father, after all. Her eyes narrowed. Don't say that where anyone can hear. Jaime gave a half-smile. I know. Call him my nephew if it pleases you. She frowned but didn't argue. Instead, she laid a hand on his chest. I'm glad you're back, Hole. He leaned in, but before they could speak further, there was a rap at the door. Cersei hissed in annoyance, stepping away. She composed herself in a heartbeat, and Jaime schooled his features into something neutral. When the door opened, it was a servant, bowing deeply, announcing that Tyrion had requested an audience with Jaime. Apparently, their father also expected to see him soon. With a nod, Jaime disengaged, adjusting his tunic. He tossed a final glance at Cersei, their eyes meeting in silent acknowledgement that nothing was simple in this city of schemes. Then he departed. Meeting Tyrion in the Solar was a curious reunion. The imp had a goblet of wine in his hand, his scarred face, souvenir from the Battle of the Blackwater, twitching with a half-smile. Well, 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 dear brother, he said, swirling the wine. You've returned unblemished. Rumor told me you'd lost a hand, or perhaps an ear or a nose, though that would have been more my style. Jaime smirked. I like to keep my looks intact. As for you, I see the scar remains." Tyrion touched it lightly. "A necessary souvenir of heroism, I'm told. So, how was your grand adventure with that warrior maiden friend of yours?" He took a seat, leaning back. "She's not exactly a friend, but she did help me survive. Saved my hand." He flexed his fingers in demonstration, which made Tyrion grin. "Always good to have two hands in this city, especially if you wish to strangle certain people. Father awaits you. He's in quite the mood these days, thanks to some plan he's cooking up with Walder Frey." Tyrion's eyes glinted with mischief. "I suspect it involves the Starks, and from what I gather, you and our dear sister are in favor of exchanging Sansa for some measure of peace. That might not align entirely with Father's designs. He's reluctant to relinquish so valuable a hostage without something bigger in return." Jaime frowned. What bigger thing could he want? The North is a ruin, the Starks in disarray. Tyrion sipped his wine. "I hear Robb Stark is to attend a wedding at the Twins, fulfilling a pledge to marry one of Walder Frey's daughters. But the young wolf has apparently broken that vow and chosen a different bride. Dear Lord Frey was most displeased. Father knows how to exploit a wounded pride, and Walder Frey is rumored to be amenable to certain suggestions. One might guess an ambush is in the works, a trap laid at a wedding feast. A red wedding, perhaps." He gave a theatrical shudder. "All rumor, of course." Jaime set his jaw. "You think Father would orchestrate a mass murder at a wedding?" Tyrion shrugged. "We're Lannisters, brother. We do what we must. But no matter what Father's planning, it will likely crush the Stark cause once and for all. Then Sansa's utility might shift. She'd be the last living Stark of any immediate consequence, if her sister remains missing. An heir to the North, as it were. Marriage alliances could be forced. The Tyrells might have an interest in that as well. Marjorie's brother Loras could always, but I digress." The mention of a red wedding left Jaime uneasy, though he tried not to show it. War demanded ruthlessness, but slaughter under guest right was an atrocity even by Lannister standards. Yet he knew his father's capacity for cold calculation. Perhaps it wasn't so improbable. He rose, feigning a casual air. "I have Father to see, then. Thank you for the forewarning." Tyrion inclined his head. "Do give him my love. Actually, on second thought, spare me the empty gestures. My place here remains precarious enough." Jaime paused at the door, glancing back at his dwarf brother, who wore cynicism like a cloak. "Don't let them overshadow you, Tyrion. You're clever enough to best them all." Tyrion offered a mirthless grin. "Cleverness only goes so far in this nest of vipers, dear brother." Jaime nodded and left. The meeting with Tywin was brisk. The Lord of Casterly Rock held court in the Hall of the Hand with all the authority of a king, though Joffrey sat the Iron Throne nominally. He outlined the tenuous alliances, the Tyrell arrangement, the precarious situation with the northern rebels, and the possibility that a swift, devastating blow at the Twins could end Robb Stark's rebellion for good. Jaime listened in silence. Finally, Tywin said, "You will remain in King's Landing with the Kingsguard. Protect Joffrey. Maintain order. Let the Starks come undone on their own. Once the North is subdued, Sansa Stark will be forcibly married to someone of our choosing, perhaps one of our bannermen, or even Tyrion if it comes to that. We need the North." Jaime let the implications settle. "And Lady Brienne, who escorted me here, she expects we'll free the girl." Tywin's lip curled. "She's idealistic. We owe her nothing. However, out of respect for her service in returning you, I won't have her slain. She can remain as a guest for now. Once the war is concluded, she can go back to her precious Tarth." Jaime gave a small nod. He rarely argued with Tywin, who brooked no dissent. But a part of him, a small, rebellious part, thought of Brienne's vow. He found it uncharacteristically difficult to simply discard the notion of Sansa's safety. Nonetheless, he buried that flicker of conscience under the weight of family duty. He bowed. "I'll do as you command." Tywin studied him a moment longer, then waved for him to go. The tension in the Red Keep in the days that followed was palpable. Even the small folk sensed that events were moving quickly. Whispers about a grand wedding at the twins spread among the court. Some of the northern lords who had sworn to Robb Stark had begun to break away or vanish entirely, presumably heading north. Cersei remained as vigilant as ever, suspicious of the Tyrells, while Margaery grew ever more beloved by the people for her charitable acts. Jaime resumed his place among the Kingsguard, clad in white cloak and golden armor. But it felt different now. He was more keenly aware of the stares, the judgments people cast his way. He had always been the Kingslayer, but something about nearly losing his hand had changed his perspective. He found himself scrutinizing Joffrey, seeing the cruelty in the boy's eyes. Once, Jaime might have embraced that cruelty as an extension of Lannister dominance. Now it made him uneasy. Still, he carried out his duties, guarding the royal family, attending council sessions when commanded. One afternoon, as he stood watch outside the royal apartments, he saw Sansa Stark pass by with her septa. She looked pale, eyes perpetually downcast, the figure of a frightened deer in a den of wolves. She glanced his way, recognized him, and offered a timid nod. Jaime felt a momentary pang. She was a girl, forcibly engaged to a monster, her family scattered. He recalled the memory of Catelyn Stark, desperate to protect her children. He had promised, albeit with cynicism, to do his part. For a moment, he considered speaking to Sansa, offering some reassurance. But that was folly. The halls were lined with watchers who would note any unexpected kindness. So he stood silent as she passed. The announcement came a week later. Robb Stark had been killed at the Twins, along with many northern lords, in an act of betrayal that would be sung of in hushed horror for generations to come. They called it the Red Wedding. Lord Walder Frey had sealed his pact with Tywin Lannister in blood, slaying guests beneath his roof. The news spread through the city like wildfire. Some cheered, believing the war nearly won. Others whispered of cursed kinslaying and the wrath of the gods. But the effect on House Stark was undeniable. The young wolf was dead, and the northern army was shattered. Sansa Stark learned of it the next morning. Jaime was present at court when Joffrey gleefully announced the victory, though victory might have been too tame a word for the butchery that had occurred. He crowed about the direwolves stuffed and mounted, about the elimination of the Stark threat. Sansa went pale as linen, then fled, tears spilling down her cheeks. Tyrion, who had been forced into a marriage with her by Tywin's decree, shot Joffrey a look of pure disgust. Margaery tried to chide Joffrey for his insensitive gloating. The boy king only grinned wider, thrilled by the savage blow dealt to his enemies. Jaime felt a hollow weight in his chest. So that was how it ended. The proud line of the Starks cut down in a feast hall, their illusions of honor drowned in a tide of blood. His father had orchestrated it, of course, and Walder Frey was the willing butcher. Catelyn Stark was dead too, they said, her throat cut and her body cast into the river. Jaime recalled the promise he'd made to her. Now that vow was as dead as she was. He retreated from the hall, ignoring the sycophants who tried to catch his eye with congratulatory smiles. He felt unclean. At last, in a deserted corridor, he paused to lean against a column, trying to compose himself. He had known war, had known betrayal. He had been the man who slew the Mad King. But that act, he told himself, had been to save thousands. This was something else. His father's cunning had always been terrifying, but now Jaime felt it personally. Brienne found him there. She approached, her face a mix of rage and sorrow. "They're all dead," she whispered, voice quivering with controlled anger. "Lady Catelyn, the Stark lords, even Robb, a slaughter. And yet you stand here wearing that Lannister lion on your chest." He couldn't meet her gaze. "What would you have me do?" She clenched her fists. "You gave her your word." He turned on her, voice rough. "I gave her my word to deliver her daughters in exchange for my freedom. I am one man, and my father controls the realm. There was nothing I could do." Brienne's jaw tightened, tears brimming. She rarely wept, but grief for the slain mother and son overcame her. "So the honorable die and the monsters laugh. Is that all there is to it?" Jaime stared at the ground. He had no words of comfort. In truth, he found none for himself either. He thought of how close he had come to losing his hand, and how that might have set him on a different path. It was a strange thing to consider, but some part of him wondered if a maimed Jaime Lannister might have found more compassion, might have tried harder to intervene, though realistically, father's plans had likely been unstoppable. Yet the doubt gnawed at him. He was whole, alive, and he remained a Lannister above all else. At length, Brienne turned away. "I won't remain here," she said quietly. "Lady Catelyn's daughters. Sansa is still alive, but she's a prisoner. I can't serve her if I stay in a cage." Jaime hesitated, then placed a hand on her arm. "If you run, they'll call you a traitor. You'll be arrested. Or worse." She shook him off. "I'll find a way. I'm not staying." Pause, then her voice lowered. "I had hoped you might understand." He swallowed, something twisting in his gut. He felt the unspoken plea for him to intervene, to free Sansa, to keep faith with a woman who had once spared his life. But he knew the cost. He was a Kingsguard sworn to protect the king. Even if he wanted to help the girl, it would set him against his father, against the crown, and he did not think he had the strength or the will to pay that price. Brienne saw his hesitation. She nodded grimly. "Very well. Fare you well, Kingslayer." And with that, she turned and strode off, leaving Jaime alone in the corridor. He watched her go, unable to call her back. A wave of conflicting emotions battered him. Anger at himself, anger at the cruelty of the world, a sense of bitter resignation. Yet he was Jaime Lannister, sworn to House Lannister, to the crown, to his father's will. Perhaps if he had lost his hand, if he had been made less, he might have felt more. Instead, he felt the deadening weight of loyalty pressing down on him. Over the ensuing weeks, the Red Wedding's aftermath rippled across the realm. The Boltons took over the north in alliance with the Freys, who were named Lords of the Trident. Sansa Stark, effectively the last known Stark of marriageable age, became a prize for the Lannisters to manipulate. Tywin forced a quick marriage between her and Tyrion, aiming to secure the claim on the north for House Lannister. Cersei merely sneered at the arrangement, while Joffrey mocked Sansa's tears and Tyrion's stature. Jaime, watching from the sidelines, felt only a grim sense of pity for the girl. She was trapped, her family gone, her future in chains. Jaime himself settled back into the role of Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, again at Tywin's insistence. That position had once been reserved for Barristan Selmy, but Joffrey had dismissed Selmy in a fit of arrogance. Jaime took up the white cloak with a mixture of pride and ambivalence. He sat on the councils, listened to the discussions of how to pacify the north, how to quell uprisings in the Riverlands, how to handle the Ironborn. Joffrey's cruelty was plain, yet the entire court danced around him, trying to flatter and restrain him. Tyrion did what he could to mitigate the worst impulses, but with Tywin looming behind the throne, the boy king was effectively reined in, at least sometimes. In the practice yard, Jaime was a sight to behold. Retaining his hand meant retaining his lethal skill, and the younger knights marveled at his prowess. He defeated one challenger after another in sparring matches, reminded them all why the name Lannister carried fearsome weight. He took a particular satisfaction in besting the vain knights who preened in front of the ladies at court. Watching them sprawl in the dust after a swift series of thrusts and parries gave him a fleeting sense of justice. This was one arena in which no political scheme could upend him. Skill was skill, and Jaime had it in abundance. Still, the knights were uneasy. He found himself thinking of Brienne often, wondering if she had managed to leave the city unseen. He never asked after her, fearing that might draw Tywin's attention. He told himself it was better not to know. But sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he imagined the simple determination in her face, the surprising kindness she had shown him. He remembered how she had saved him from Locke, how that single moment had preserved his identity, and he felt a stab of regret that he had not done more for her, or for the Stark girls. Time moved forward as it always did. The war died down, replaced by pockets of rebellion. The Tyrells pressed for Marjorie's wedding to Joffrey, preparing a grand ceremony that rivaled the lavish spectacle of the Blackwater Victory Feast. The city bustled with preparations, decorations, feasts, shipments of exotic foods and wines. The tension between Cersei and Marjorie simmered, each vying for the Boy King's favor, each wanting to keep or gain power. Tyrion brooded, stuck in a marriage with Sansa that neither desired. Tywin orchestrated everything with cold precision. Jaime stood at Joffrey's side on the day of the royal wedding, clad in resplendent armor of white and gold, bearing his sword with easy grace. He watched as Joffrey took Marjorie's hand before the High Septon, the crowd roaring its approval. The new queen was radiant, but Jaime could see the fear behind her eyes. She knew what sort of man-boy she was wedding. Everyone in King's Landing knew. The feast was a display of opulence. Mummers, jugglers, singers, dwarfs on pigback reenacting the War of the Five Kings in grotesque parody. Joffrey laughed cruelly, hurling insults. Wine flowed freely. Jaime circled the outskirts of the dais, watchful, while Sansa and Tyrion sat awkwardly, the butt of Joffrey's constant japes. The atmosphere seemed too bright, too garish, as though something foul lurked just beneath the surface. When the moment came, when Joffrey began to choke after sipping from the large chalice of wine, Jaime's first thought was some childish tantrum. Then he saw the panic in the boy's eyes, the foam at his mouth. Chaos erupted. Cersei screamed, the crowd surged, and Jaime sprang forward. He tried to pat Joffrey on the back, tried to see if there was something lodged in his throat, but the boy's face turned a horrible purple. He convulsed, eyes bulging. Poison, Jaime realized, horror dawning. He looked around wildly. Tyrion stood there, holding the empty chalice, looking stunned. Sansa cowered beside him. Cersei shrieked for the guards to seize them. Tywin rose, barking orders, face wrought with anger. The King's Guard scrambled, but it was Jaime who held Joffrey in his arms as he writhed in his final moments. Jaime's heart pounded. This was his son dying, though no one knew that truth. Guilt, anger, and a profound helplessness washed over him. He had done so many terrible things to protect the boy, and now he was dying in front of him, undone by some assassin's cruelty. Joffrey's death left the realm unbalanced once more. Accusations flew. Tyrion was arrested almost immediately, accused of regicide. Sansa vanished in the confusion, which only deepened the suspicion that the Starks had a hand in it. Chaos reigned in King's Landing. Marjorie Tyrell became a widow on her wedding day, her family outraged, the alliance with the Lannisters shaken. Cersei retreated into a vengeful madness, vowing to see Tyrion's head on a spike. Tywin tried to steady the ship, naming Tommen as the next king, but the blow to Lannister power was enormous. Jaime was torn in too many directions. He had lost his secret son, was forced to watch Tyrion condemned, and realized Sansa had escaped. If it was her doing or some friend of the Starks, he didn't know. But in the days and weeks that followed, he felt the ground shift. And under him. Tywin demanded he remain on the Kingsguard, which he did, but the old man's wrath was cold and deep. Cersei's grief turned to a smoldering need for revenge. Trial after trial, with Tyrion forced to stand for regicide, culminating in the fiasco of a trial by combat. Throughout it all, Jaime could not escape the feeling that his father's empire was cracking. The Red Wedding had shattered the Starks, but retribution had come in an unexpected form. In the swirl of those events, he also discovered that Brienne had been captured by his father's men on her way out of the city, held briefly, then released. Some whim of Tywin's, apparently, or perhaps due to Jaime's quiet urging. He wasn't certain. She was gone again. He had no idea where, but he found himself hoping she was far away from the Viper's Pit that was King's Landing. Then came the night Tyrion escaped. Jaime found himself in the dungeons, heart pounding, unlocking his brother's cell and ushering him to freedom. By that point, he had realized how deeply wrong it all was. Tyrion was no murderer of Joffrey, or if he was, Jaime didn't want to know. The city had become a place of nightmares. Jaime had tried to cling to some remnants of honor, but it came too little, too late. Tyrion's parting words and the revelation that their father had bedded Shay Tyrion's lover, led to an explosive chain of events. Tywin, the Great Lion, slain on the privy by a crossbow bolt. For Jaime, that was the final blow. House Lannister, so mighty, had lost its patriarch, its heir Joffrey, and many illusions. What remained was a broken family with tenuous power in the capital. Tommen was crowned king, but he was a sweet boy, easily guided by Cersei. Chaos threatened to engulf the city once more, as new foes rose, from the Tyrells to the Faith militant. Through it all, Jaime lived with the knowledge that if he had lost his hand that day with Locke, his life's path would have been entirely different. Perhaps he would have remained captive, forced to relearn everything, forced to rely on others. Perhaps he would have come to a deeper empathy. Perhaps he would have never had the chance to stand by helplessly while the Red Wedding sealed House Stark's doom. Perhaps he wouldn't have had to hold his dying son, or watch his brother stand accused of murder, or see his father undone by a crossbow bolt. And perhaps, in that alternate life, he might have found a measure of redemption. But that was not this life. In this life, Jaime Lannister kept his hand. He remained the realm's greatest living swordsman, the shining knight of the Kingsguard, the scion of House Lannister's martial pride. He also remained complicit in all the horrors that transpired: the Red Wedding, the captivity of Sansa Stark, the tyranny of Joffrey, the tyranny of Tywin. Every battle and duel that might have tested him, he won with ease. But with every victory, a part of him felt more hollow. Once, he'd exulted in the knowledge that none could best him in single combat. Now, he almost wished someone could, for it might have granted him an escape from the labyrinth of guilt and duty in which he was ensnared. He led the Crown's armies to quell revolts in the Riverlands. He personally slew 2 knights loyal to the Blackfish Tully at Riverrun. He forced them into surrender, brandishing his sword, unstoppable, undefeated. The sight of his golden hair and lion-crested armor struck fear into every foe. The camps of the outlaws scattered at his approach. The small folk learned to dread the arrival of the Kingslayer, who never hesitated to crush rebellion in the name of the boy King Tommen. He did so out of obligation, out of a desire to hold the realm together, and out of a longing, perhaps, for some shred of purpose. Yet each swing of the sword weighed more heavily on his conscience, buried though it might be. He was a man shaped by war and family, but he no longer believed in the virtue of it. Meanwhile, the realm faced other threats. The Ironborn stirred in the west. The Dornish whispered of vengeance for Elia Martell and Oberyn Martell. The Tyrells bristled under Cersei's authority. And from across the narrow sea, rumors came of Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons. Jaime sat through council meetings, ignoring the tension as Mace Tyrell boasted about Highgarden's strength and Cersei spat venom at anyone who dared question her. He felt a strange apathy, as if the game was rigged from the start. He had power, he had skill. He was dreaded across the 7 kingdoms, but inside, a coil of regret tightened daily. And so it went on and on, the days turning into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Jaime Lannister, the man who kept his hand, remained a pillar of the Lannister regime. He won every duel that presented itself, from petty knights seeking fame to wily sellswords testing the legend. He cut them all down with chilling elegance. He commanded the field in every major engagement, never once bested by any champion. Even the threatening swirl of the Faith militants' rise didn't truly frighten him. He was certain he could carve through them if need be. Yet no matter how many times he proved his might, a gnawing sense of emptiness consumed him. Cersei grew more paranoid, especially after Tyrion's escape. She launched hunts for her brother, any rumor of his presence leading to brutal crackdowns. Jaime oversaw some of these efforts, though his heart wasn't in it. He remembered his last parting with Tyrion, the fury and betrayal in the dwarf's eyes after he learned certain truths about Tisha. Jaime bore that guilt as well, layered upon so many others. The cracks in his relationship with Cersei also widened. She resented that he could not prevent Joffrey's death, that he had helped Tyrion. She turned to other strategies, forging new alliances, even entertaining Qyburn's unsavory experiments. Jaime watched her from a distance, feeling her slip away, or perhaps it was he who slipped away from her. The bond they once had felt soiled by everything that had transpired. Even so, Jaime continued to fight because that was what he did best. It was as if the sword had become an extension of his soul, the only place where he found clarity. On the training grounds, when steel met steel, all the contradictions of politics and betrayal receded. In the dance of a duel, Jaime moved with lethal grace, a living testament to what a knight could be in skill, if not in virtue. But skill alone could not save the realm from itself. The War of the Five Kings concluded in a messy swirl of backstabbing alliances, and a new chaos seemed to loom on the horizon, with White Walkers rumored in the far north and dragons rising in the east. Jaime found himself called upon to ride north eventually, with the Lannister host, to join the realm's forces in defending against the Whites, if the rumors proved true. He might have scoffed at such tales once, but too many improbable things had happened not to lend some credence. In that bleak scenario, Jaime marched with banners flying, golden lion on crimson field. Though the realm was battered, though the Lannisters were reduced by internal strife, they still wielded a formidable army. And Jaime was still the realm's most feared swordsman. If an army of the dead was coming, who better to stand against them? And so, as the snows crept south, as ravens brought word of an impending doom, Jaime found himself on the King's Road, heading north, ironically, to perhaps fight alongside the remnants of the other great houses. The possibility of a truce with Daenerys Targaryen surfaced. Sansa Stark, thought missing, had reemerged in the north, allied with the Vale, forging a new seat of power in Winterfell. The threads of old conflicts tangled into new alliances. Jaime marched in the midst of the Lannister column, hand resting on his sword hilt. In his mind, he wondered if he might meet Brienne of Tarth again, or if he would see Sansa Stark, once a trembling girl, now rumored to be a resolute lady of Winterfell. He wondered what judgments they might pass on him, if Brienne still held him in contempt, if Sansa would remember how he had done nothing to save her mother or her brother. He tried not to dwell on it, but as the cold wind whipped at his cloak, carrying the sting of ice, Jaime realized that the war for the Dawn might be the final measure of a man like him. Perhaps in the face of the undead, with the fate of the living at stake, he could at last find a purpose that felt worthy. And if he died in that struggle, at least it would be something other than another slaughter for ambition. A faint flicker of hope? No, not quite hope. Resolution, perhaps. The battles that followed in the north were grim. The dead advanced, unstoppable in number, and the living formed a tenuous alliance. The field outside Winterfell became the site of unimaginable carnage. Jaime rode at the head of a wedge of Lannister knights, gold armor glimmering in torchlight against the endless night. The Whites crashed upon them, a sea of pale faces and skeletal forms. Jaime's sword whirled, cutting them down in droves, but they kept coming. He felt fear like he had never known, yet also an odd exhilaration. This was not a war for a throne or a castle or a name. It was a war for survival itself. At some point in the chaos, Jaime spotted a figure in the swirling snow, a tall warrior in dark plate, fighting with a valiant fury. It was Brienne. She hacked at the undead with her broad blade, forging a path toward him. Their eyes met across the carnage. For a moment, recognition flared, but no words could be exchanged in that storm of ice and death. He pivoted to slay a cluster of Whites closing in on her flank. She returned the favor, decapitating one that lunged for his back. They fought side by side in a strangely fluid dance of steel, the memory of old tensions overshadowed by the shared struggle to survive. When the dawn broke, it was a miracle that the living still held the field. The White Walkers had been driven back, or so the stories said. Others claimed it was the work of a dragon queen's sacrifices, or some heroic moment from a chosen champion. Jaime never saw the end clearly. He only knew that after hours of fighting, the horde of the dead shattered like glass, and the survivors stumbled among heaps of corpses. The next day, as the pyres burned, Jaime found Brienne tending to the wounded. Her armor was dented, her face streaked with blood and soot. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, part relief, part sorrow, perhaps even a glint of gratitude. He inclined his head, unsure what words could bridge the gulf that yawned between them. That night, in the ruins of an old hall near Winterfell, they found a corner to speak. It was awkward at first, overshadowed by the memories of so much bloodshed. Finally, Brienne said, "You fight well, Kingslayer." Jaime managed a weary smirk. "It seems I've had many chances to prove it." She studied him as if searching for something. "Did you regret any of it?" She didn't have to specify. He knew what she meant. The Red Wedding, his role in the Lannister tyranny, the vow to Catelyn Stark, Sansa's captivity. He exhaled, looked away. "Every day now, but I can't change it." She nodded slowly, exhaustion etched into her features. "Perhaps the war with the dead will change us all. We have to rebuild now." Jaime glanced at his hands, still whole. He wondered if losing one would have made him less complicit in Tywin's schemes, more willing to forge his own path. But he couldn't rewrite the past. "If I can help, I will," he said softly. It was neither an oath nor a promise, but more sincere than many of the vows he had spoken in his life. Brienne inclined her head, eyes lingering on him. There was a silence between them that felt strangely peaceful, even amid the devastation. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him alone. Jaime stood there, the cold northern wind wrapping around him, the distant fires crackling. He had survived once again. He had been at the apex of every duel, had shaped the outcome of many battles with his still intact sword hand. His skill was legend, and the blood on his hands was beyond measure. Yet perhaps, in this new dawn after the long night, there was a sliver of something else, redemption, atonement, or at least acceptance. He didn't know if the realm would ever truly heal. The scars ran too deep, from the Red Wedding to the sack of King's Landing in days past, from the betrayal and conspiracies that defined the war. The undead threat might have receded, but new challenges would rise. Daenerys Targaryen, if she still lived, might stake her claim on the Iron Throne. Sansa Stark might seek to solidify the North's independence. The Lannisters would cling to what power remained them in the South. The game would go on, and he would be expected to play his part. But for the first time in a long while, Jaime felt the faintest glimmer of his old self, the young knight who had once dreamed of honor before he had become a Kingslayer. Standing in the ashes of war, he knew that skill in arms was both a gift and a curse. He had been unstoppable, his duels and battles shaping the fate of armies. He had carved a path for House Lannister, enabling them to commit untold atrocities. He had served a cruel king, saved a monstrous boy, and maintained a legacy of violence. And yet, in this final battle against the dead, that skill had also helped save lives, had held back an unimaginable darkness. In the end, perhaps all he could do was continue to fight as best he could, for whatever cause he deemed just or necessary. He had kept his hand, and thus remained Jaime Lannister, formidable, proud, flawed. If there was a better version of himself to be found, he might find it in small acts, in fleeting moments of decency, in the choice not to turn away when the realm needed him. Would it be enough to wash away the sins he'd amassed? Likely not, but it might be enough to face each new day with a shred of dignity. So he took a deep breath, letting the icy air fill his lungs, and fixed his gaze on the horizon. The war wasn't over. The realm was cracked, but not broken. The path ahead was uncertain, but still open. He felt the leather of his sword grip beneath his fingers, reassuring him of the skill he still possessed. For better or worse, Jaime Lannister would carry on, forging his destiny with a hand that had remained whole, for all the good and ill that came of it. If he had been shaped by that hand, perhaps he might yet shape something else, something worth saving in the scattered remains of the Seven Kingdoms. For now, at least, he was alive and unmaimed. The Golden Lion was free to roam. And in a land so ravaged by war and darkness, maybe that simple truth was the faintest spark of hope. A chance, however slim, to turn his legendary prowess towards something nobler than the next betrayal. It was a question for the morrow, and like all questions in Westeros, one that would be answered only by steel, cunning, and the fragile bonds between unlikely allies. Jaime Lannister awoke to a dim pre-dawn sky above the battlements of Winterfell. his breath plumed in the cold air, and as he sat up on the cot he had taken near the great hall, he felt a stab of stiffness in his muscles that reminded him of just how long the battle against the dead had lasted. The walls were silent now, save for the gentle stirring of a few crows, and an occasional clang of metal where the castle guards changed shifts. In every courtyard and corridor, the scars of that final struggle against the Night King's horde remained. Half-burned timbers, shattered parapets, and swaths of churned mud where pyres had raged. A few battered tents still dotted the courtyards for those among the defenders who'd arrived too late or in too great a number to find proper lodging. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the last remnants of sleep slip away. Sometimes he still saw the whites looming in his dreams, their eyes glowing with icy malice, their hands clutching for flesh. Many men and women had fallen, some in heroic last stands, others quietly in the crush of the horde. The victory had come at a cost that felt incalculable, and yet the living had prevailed by the narrowest margin. Whether it was the Targaryen dragonfire from Daenerys, or the combined might of Northmen, Southerners, and the Free Folk, or some stroke of luck or fate, Jaime could not say. All he knew was that he had survived. He rose to his feet, rolling the stiffness from his shoulders and arms. He still wore his white Kingsguard cloak out of habit. Though soiled and smoky as it was, it bore little resemblance to the pristine garment from King's Landing. The Red Keep and its intrigues felt a lifetime away, yet he was still Jaime Lannister, still the famed swordsman, still whole in body, still the man who had helped enforce his father's brutal will, who had once stood by as the Stark family was shattered. And now he stood in Winterfell, side by side with the remnants of that family, and with others who had once been his enemies. He left the small corner of the yard where he'd been bedding down and made his way along the inner walls. The first glimmer of dawn touched the eastern sky, painting the clouds with a pale rose hue. Passing a pair of Stark guards wearing the direwolf sigil, he gave them a polite nod. They stared back with guarded expressions. Lannister or not, Kingslayer or not, he had fought for them in the end, and that had earned him a cautious respect. But the memory of the Red Wedding and the devastation wrought by House Lannister's alliances still lingered like a shadow. Acceptance would not come easily. As he turned a corner near the broken tower, he saw Ser Brienne of Tarth. She stood alone, gazing over the walls at the silent horizon. Her broad shoulders bore fresh scratches, and her armor was dented from the great fight, but she looked as steady as ever. Her big sword, Oathkeeper, rested sheathed at her side, the hilt still showing glints of Valyrian steel in the early light. Jaime paused, uncertain whether to approach or give her space. Brienne, however, turned her head and saw him. Her expression did not soften, but neither did she scowl. He stepped closer. "You're awake early." She nodded. "It's hard to sleep." Her voice carried a quiet weight. "I keep expecting to hear the shrieks of the dead." Jaime understood the sentiment all too well. He rested his forearms on the wall's edge, looking out. A thin layer of frost sparkled across the training yard below. "It'll be a long time before anyone here forgets. Those who survived, anyway." Brienne let the silence stretch a moment. Then she asked, "How many do you think we lost?" He shook his head. "Hundreds? Thousands across the whole north? I don't know the count. Too many." He could still smell the ashes from the funeral pyres that had been lit for days and nights after the battle. It was a stench that clung to the stones of Winterfell and coated the back of the throat in bitter residue. She swallowed. "I was seeing to the wounded yesterday." A subtle tremor ran through her voice. "There are so many missing limbs, missing eyes. Some can't speak of what they saw. Others won't live through the week. And for those that do, there are the scars." Jaime nodded. "A good many scars, yes." He flexed his own sword hand, though no wound marred it. He remembered how very close he had come, once, to being reduced to a fraction of himself. The memories of Locke and the roar of Brienne, how she'd fought for him, flickered in his mind. Felt like a different lifetime. Brienne's eyes flicked to him briefly. "Have you given any thought to where you'll go now?" "I suppose I remain sworn to protect the king." He gave a slight shrug. "Though Tommen is in King's Landing, and I have no notion of how things stand there." With my father gone, with Tyrion fled, with Joffrey dead. The city is Cersei's realm, for better or worse. He might have said more, but the frustration or sorrow still knotted in him. I don't doubt Cersei's hold on power is tenuous. The Tyrells will be clamoring for their share of influence. The faith militant might be stirring, and the realm is battered. Brienne regarded him steadily. King Tommen might need your protection, but what about the realm needing your protection from Cersei? He almost laughed, but it came out harsh. You speak bold words for one once deemed my prisoner. There was no heat in the remark, only a hollow note of irony. I don't know if there's anything I can do about Cersei. She won't listen to me, not now. The war changed her. We've grown apart, and I doubt she'd trust me any longer, not after what happened with Tyrion. Brienne said nothing, and Jaime's gaze shifted back to the dawn. It was a delicate subject for him. Tyrion, father, everything. In that quiet, he wondered if he might find a different path, something away from the Red Keep. But that was not an easy thought. He was a Kingsguard, once sworn for life, and he was Jaime Lannister, with all the burdens and allegiances that implied. I have a duty, he said at last, even if I'm not certain what that duty truly is now. Brienne let out a breath. You fought for the living in that courtyard. That's worth something. Maybe it's enough to set you on a new path. She turned away from the wall. I'm going to see about the morning watch, and then I'll check the wounded again. He managed a faint nod. Until later, Sir Brienne. She dipped her head in acknowledgement and walked down the steps. Jaime watched her go, remembering how they had stood side by side in the chaos, how they had saved one another from certain death. He felt some strange mix of gratitude and guilt whenever he looked at her. She was one of the few who had seen him at his weakest and saved him from it. There was a fragile bond there, but the differences between them were like chasms. Still, he found he could not entirely regret it. At length, Jaime left the wall. The courtyard below was stirring with morning tasks. Men-at-arms setting up cook fires, grooms hauling feed, women from the kitchens rushing about with pots. Winterfell, damaged yet not destroyed, was slowly rousing to life. The first hush after the battle had given way to this new bustle, as survivors tried to find normalcy again. He spotted Podrick Payne in the yard, the boy who had once served Tyrion but later followed Brienne. Podrick was trying to help a blacksmith ferry tools from one area to another. When Jaime's gaze fell on him, Podrick froze for a moment, then gave a hurried nod of greeting. Jaime raised a hand in return. The boy looked older than Jaime remembered, and more confident, though still overshadowed by the great shapes of the northern men hurrying past. Jaime pressed on until he came to the great hall. Outside, the battered Stark banners, gray direwolf on a field of white, hung next to a newer sigil, a golden lion on crimson. The Union of the Living had demanded all houses place their banners, side by side, as a show of unity. Others, too, had once hung there, the mockingbird of Peter Baelish, the sun and spear of Dorne, but many had been taken down as lords departed or perished. The Tyrell rose no longer hung, courtesy of their unsteady alliance. Some men whispered that the Tyrell host had retreated south after the final battle, Mace Tyrell eager to preserve what was left of his forces. Sansa Stark was likely inside, he thought. She was the Lady of Winterfell now. No official ceremony had pronounced her so, but after all that had befallen her family, it was more or less accepted by the Northern Lords and any other survivors. They called her the Lady of the North. Some said there were other Starks scattered about. Bran rumored beyond the wall, Arya vanished to foreign lands, Rickon rumored dead, but only Sansa had emerged to claim the seat. The faces of the Northern Lords reminded Jaime of that complicated reality. House Stark had once been proud and numerous, but war had reduced them drastically. Drawing a breath, he stepped inside. The great hall was alive with voices as men broke their fast. Torches lit the stone walls, and a fire crackled in the central hearth. Some of the North survivors, House Mormont, House Serwyn, House Glover, huddled at tables, conferring with maesters or with one another. They wore heavy cloaks, for even though winter's cold was receding in the immediate aftermath of the long night's defeat, The chill in the air was still a far cry from the mild breezes of the south. A hush fell here and there as people noticed Jaime, the golden lion in their midst. Few greeted him, though none challenged him outright. He was tolerated, more or less, for his valor in the battle. But years of enmity did not disappear overnight. He spotted Sansa at the high table, going over parchments with a steward. The flicker of torchlight caught in her auburn hair. She was thin but composed, wearing a warm gray gown with her house sigil embroidered in subtle thread. A faint line of worry etched her brow as she read the parchment, but as Jaime approached, she lifted her eyes. "Sir Jaime," she said politely, though her tone carried cool reserve. "Good morning." He inclined his head. "My lady, I trust you slept better than I did." A small, sad smile curved her lips, and she set the parchment aside. "I doubt anyone in Winterfell sleeps well these days." She gestured for him to approach the table. "I was going over the ledgers of food stores. With so many new arrivals, men from the west, from the Vale, from across the narrow sea, we're pressed to feed them. We'll manage for a time if we ration carefully." Jaime glanced at the rows of figures. "I can imagine. War leaves nothing easy in its wake." She studied him, and for a moment he thought he glimpsed the frightened girl she had been when he first knew her in King's Landing. But that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had weathered unimaginable trials, Lannister cruelties among them. "What will you do now?" she asked, soft but steady. He hesitated. "I've considered returning south to see how my family fares, but I'm not sure there's much left for me there, beyond a queen regent clinging to a broken throne. The realm is in tatters." Sansa nodded. "It is, and while we appreciate your help, many in the north are not so quick to forget what befell my mother and brother at the Twins." She said it gently yet firmly. "Nor do they forget that House Lannister played its part in that horror." Jaime's throat tightened. "I am well aware," he said, voice low, "and well aware of my own failings." He made himself meet her eyes. "If I could undo that day, Lady Sansa, I would. But I cannot." She absorbed that quietly. "There's no bringing them back. We can only move forward." A moment passed, the hall's chatter surging around them. "We may have to forge new alliances if the North is to survive what comes next. We've bested the dead, but the realm is still raw. And I suspect the dragons from the east will not remain quiet forever." Jaime recalled hearing how Daenerys Targaryen had fought beside them, at least in part, her dragons unleashing fire on the whites. But her main host, the Unsullied and Dothraki, had been scattered. Some said they marched south again after the battle, following their queen in pursuit of the Iron Throne. Others whispered that a new alliance had been reached, that Daenerys might try to unify the realm in peace. Jaime doubted it would be so simple. The Targaryen queen possessed an unyielding sense of destiny. If the rumors were true, and she had reason to despise Lannisters, after the deaths of her kin at the end of the Mad King's reign, Jaime himself had plunged his sword into that monarch's back. A necessary evil, but he doubted Daenerys would see it that way. He forced his mind back to the present. "What alliances did you have in mind, my lady?" Sansa's features turned guarded again. "I'm not certain yet. The Vale has been a loyal friend. Lord Royce and the other knights remain our close allies for now, especially after the victory here. The Riverlands remain in disarray, with House Tully nearly extinct, and the Freys cast into infamy after their treachery. The West belongs to your house, though with Lord Tywin dead, the question is who truly leads the Rock now." Jaime's mouth thinned. "It would pass to Tyrion, technically, since I'm in the Kingsguard. But Tyrion is an exile, a fugitive from King's Landing's justice, and I doubt the West would accept him readily. Kevin Lannister was father's brother, but he's gone too. Lancel, well, that's another matter. If Cersei tries to claim it, no doubt the lords might contest it. It's a mess." He paused, feeling the pang of all that was lost. House Lannister is a shadow of what it was, in truth. Without father, there is no real authority, save for Cersei's, which is tenuous at best. She might hold the Iron Throne by controlling Tommen, but that doesn't sway the West entirely. Sansa tapped her fingers on the table. I see. Another silence drew out. Around them, guards hustled to and fro, delivering messages, distributing bread and ale. Finally, she spoke softly, almost gently. I won't claim to forgive all that your family has done to mine, Ser Jaime, but we have to find a way to shape a better future. Our enemies were always legion, the Boltons, the Freys, the Lannisters, the dead, and yet we overcame so much. I would see that continue, if possible. If possible, Jaime echoed. He nodded. The North has reason to resent me, but if you'll allow it, I'd like to remain for a while. At least until we know how best to proceed with the Southern Lords. I may be of use. He felt a hollow sense of irony. Once he had been so certain that the only place for him was King's Landing, at Cersei's side. Now he asked permission to linger in Winterfell of all places. Yet something in him wanted to see if he could help rebuild rather than tear down. Sansa weighed his words. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "We have need of skilled swordsmen. But more than that, we have need of people willing to protect the living without cunning or cruelty. If you can truly pledge yourself to that, Ser Jaime, I won't turn you away." He inclined his head, acknowledging the gravity of the moment. "Thank you, my lady. You have my word." She offered a faint smile, though sadness glimmered behind it. "Very well. We'll speak again soon. I have to finish going through these ledgers, or we'll have nothing but boiled leather for dinner next month." He let her return to her work, stepping away from the high table. As he walked, the memory of their conversation flickered in his mind. Sansa Stark, once the captive girl in King's Landing, now the Lady of Winterfell, inviting him to stay. The world had truly turned upside down. Outside, the sun had risen higher, bright enough to cast pale golden beams over the courtyard. Jaime decided to head to the practice yard. There was always a part of him that found solace in the forms of swordplay. Even after all the horror of the long night, the rhythms of training footwork, balance, strike, parry, provided a stable anchor in his mind, something purely physical in a world otherwise governed by schemes. He found the yard nearly empty, though a few men were practicing archery. A battered target hung from a post, riddled with arrows. Jaime saw a cluster of newly minted warriors from the Vale testing each other with blunted steel. They paused as he approached, eyes flicking warily to the golden lion on his breastplate. He offered them a curt nod. Setting aside his cloak, he loosened his shoulders, drew his blade, still the one he had carried for years, a well-forged steel gifted by his father, though not Valyrian steel, and began the exercises he knew so well. The crisp air sharpened his senses. He moved through the forms. The lion's bite, the dance of steel, the lightning riposte. Each stance and thrust reminded him of just how easily he'd cut down foes in so many battles. But it was different now. After facing the dead, after seeing how swords had little meaning unless they were used for something beyond ambition, each stroke carried a subtle gravity. He thought of the men and women who had fallen here in the north, the ones who had died so others might live. His muscles were beginning to warm when a voice interrupted him. "Ser Jaime," someone called. He paused mid-thrust and turned. Podrick Payne stood a few yards away, holding a practice sword in uncertain fingers. A flush colored the young man's cheeks. I was hoping to train a bit. My sword hand, it's still clumsy sometimes." Jaime studied him. "Where's Brienne?" Podrick glanced around, a little anxious. "Ser Brienne is busy with the wounded, and with matters of security. I thought I might ask if you'd give me pointers, my lord." He quickly amended, Ser Jaime." Jaime gave him a faint smile. "You'll not learn much by cowering, Podrick. Step forward." Podrick obeyed, lifting the practice sword. It was a blunt steel edge, heavier than a standard blade. The young man shifted his weight awkwardly, trying to mimic a stance he must have seen from Brienne. Jaime exhaled quietly, remembering the days when he himself had trained with the best in the realm. Once, he would have found it tedious to instruct a novice. Now, he found it strangely grounding. "All right," Jaime said. "First, your feet." He tapped Podrick's ankle with his own boot. "Wider. You want a solid base, or you'll topple if an opponent parries you hard. Good. Now raise that blade, no, not so high. If your arms get tired, you'll drop the point. Keep it at chest level. Podrick tried to comply. Jaime circled him, adjusting his posture. When that was done, Jaime picked up a second practice sword from a rack. Now, show me how you'd strike if I were in front of you. Podrick lunged tentatively. Jaime parried with ease, the dull clang of metal echoing in the cold air. Faster, Jaime said. Podrick tried again, still stiff and uncertain. You're thinking too much. The moment you move, your enemy is deciding how to cut you down. You don't have time to be polite. Yes, sir? Podrick breathed, trying again. They continued this for a time, the onlookers losing interest as they returned to their own drills. Jaime found a measure of satisfaction in correcting Podrick's stance, guiding him to pivot at the right moment or to keep his blade angled properly. The boy clearly admired Brienne, and that alone made Jaime want to help him. If anyone deserved a loyal squire, it was Brienne, and if Podrick survived the war, perhaps he'd become a decent knight in his own right. Eventually, Podrick lowered his sword, arms trembling from the exercise. He wiped sweat from his brow, though the morning air was quite cold. "Thank you," he panted. I appreciate the lesson." Jaime returned the practice sword to the rack. "You've got determination, I'll give you that. Keep practicing. Ask Brienne to show you her footwork. I've never seen a knight quite like her. She's a fortress on two legs." Podrick smiled a little. "She is. She's the best person I've ever known, I think. Always honest. Always tries to do the right thing." Jaime nodded, feeling a pang of something, envy or admiration. He couldn't say. "Indeed. Go on, then. Find some food before we freeze out here." Podrick scurried off, and Jaime resumed his own routine briefly, letting the repetitive motions clear his head. After a while, his breath formed short clouds with each exhalation, his body moving with the grace of a man who had spent decades in combat. He ended with a final flourish, blade slicing the air in a wide arc, then sheathed his steel. The day was fully underway, and he had no illusions that idling about with a sword would solve the realm's troubles. He made for the castle's inner keep, winding through narrow corridors blackened by old soot. In some places, the walls showed fresh repairs. In others, entire sections remained collapsed. Men in stark livery were at work, hauling stones, patching holes, trying to restore the fortress's lost grandeur. He passed a group of free folk, wildlings as Southerners called them, distributing goods. After the alliance forged by Jon Snow, so he'd heard, the wildlings had come south to help fight the dead, many of them losing their own in the process. Now they lingered, uncertain whether to return to the far north or remain near Winterfell. Jaime saw the guarded expressions on both sides whenever wildlings and Northmen crossed paths. Old enmities, old prejudices. Yet they had all bled together against the Whites. He wondered fleetingly where Jon Snow was now. Rumors said he'd traveled to Dragonstone with Daenerys Targaryen to regroup, or that he had vanished after the battle, or that he died and risen again, so many conflicting stories. The man was half legend in the north. Jaime realized with a twist of irony that Jon Snow was Ned Stark's bastard son. Once, the Lannisters had scorned him as irrelevant, but fate had placed him at the center of the War for the Dawn. Finding no immediate errands pressed upon him, Jaime drifted toward the castle library. He had heard that Samwell Tarly, a friend of Jon Snow's, was about somewhere, collecting accounts of the Long Night, but he was uncertain if Sam still remained at Winterfell or had traveled elsewhere. The library was quiet, battered, many shelves overturned or burned. The gloom inside was lit by narrow windows letting in weak sunlight. A maester and a couple of scribes toiled in a corner, sorting salvageable scrolls. For a moment, Jaime simply walked among the shelves, feeling an odd dislocation. He was not a man known for reading. Swordsmanship had been his calling since youth, but he found himself pausing to think of how much of the realm's knowledge was lost in these wars, of how ephemeral all their ambitions were compared to the white nothingness that nearly consumed them all. He emerged again into the corridor, the day feeling strangely still in his bones. Every so often, a memory would flash. Joffrey's face turning purple as he choked, Tyrion's horrified expression in the trial, father staring at him with cold authority, Catelyn Stark's final haunted look before her murder at the twins. All of it had led here, to this uneasy quiet. Jaime almost laughed at how little sense it made. He resolved to speak with Brienne again, if only to see if there was some immediate need for him. Doing good with a sword might be the only path left to him if he truly wanted to make amends. Though the North would never fully accept him, he might at least do something worthwhile. He also thought of writing to King's Landing. Yet the notion of corresponding with Cersei felt like dragging a chain behind him. She would want him back in the capital, no doubt, to enforce her will. He had no illusions that returning would lead to anything but more conflict and heartbreak. Still, Tommen was there. Tommen, a boy so gentle he'd barely survived the brutality of court. If Jaime had any paternal instincts left unpoisoned by shame, they stirred at the thought of Tommen alone in that viper's nest. But how could Jaime protect Tommen from here? Could he even protect him in King's Landing, if that meant standing against Cersei? He'd been unable to protect Joffrey from the poison that ended his life at his own wedding feast. He'd been powerless to stop the chain of events that ended with Tywin murdered on the privy, or Tyrion forced to flee. He found Brienne in the outer yard, near the stables. She was overseeing the distribution of horses to a handful of men preparing to ride to nearby holdfasts and search for straggling pockets of whites or lost survivors. Her voice was calm, authoritative. She wore no cloak today, exposing the battered breastplate that bore some chipped enamel of her own House Tarth sigil. She took note of Jaime as he approached, but did not break from her instructions until she finished speaking. "Check the roads to the south as well," she was telling the men. "And if you find any farmers in need, see if you can spare them seed or tools. We have some left in the wagons." The men saluted and rode off, their horses' hooves clattering on the cold ground. Brienne turned to Jaime. "You've been busy, I see. I heard you've been in the practice yard." He offered a slight smile. "Only a bit. Helping Podrick, mostly." She folded her arms. "Thank you for that. He's quite earnest, but still clumsy at times. He'd never forgive himself if he let me down in a fight." A faint note of affection crept into her otherwise steady tone. Jaime glanced toward the gate. "I see you're sending men to comb the countryside." She nodded. "Yes, we need to ensure no stray whites remain. They say once the Night King was destroyed, all his creatures fell. But better to be certain. The small folk are terrified." Jaime thought of the outlying villages he'd passed on his way to Winterfell. Many were gutted by raids or the dead. Some were little more than scorched timbers. "They've every right to be, but I'm glad you're showing them some mercy. Too often, armies just trample over them." Her eyes flicked to him. "You sound surprised that I care." He held her gaze. "Not surprised. I've seen your heart, Brienne. Whether you like it or not, you've always tried to do right by the innocent." She seemed momentarily taken aback, then cleared her throat. "We do what we must. Winterfell's resources are stretched thin, but it's only decent to help. If we leave them to starve, they'll turn on us or die. Either way, that does no good." She studied him for a moment. "What of you? Have you decided your next move?" He exhaled. "Sansa gave me leave to remain if I wished. I told her I'd stay for a time, see if I could do any good." Brienne's posture stiffened slightly, as if bracing for an argument. "You said that to her?" "Yes. Does it trouble you?" A flicker passed over her features, something between relief and concern. "Not exactly, but you understand that many here see you as the face of the family that orchestrated the slaughter of their lords at the Twins. Some will never trust you. Some may try to kill you." Jaime shrugged. "They're welcome to try, though I'd prefer if it didn't come to that. I'm not here to rehash old grudges. The dead nearly ended us all, and if there's more war to come, perhaps I can help prevent it." Brienne took that in. "Then you should know that Lady Sansa and others hope to negotiate with Daenerys Targaryen at some point. She fought alongside us, but there's tension. The North doesn't want to bend the knee lightly, and Daenerys doesn't want to relinquish her claim on the throne, especially when Cersei Lannister sits there." He grimaced. Yes, that's a conflict I've been dreading. If Daenerys truly wants the throne, and Cersei will never yield it, we're in for another war. Brienne's voice was quiet. And if it comes to that, which side would you choose, Jaime? He hesitated. Once, he would have answered instantly that he stood with Cersei, with House Lannister. But so much had changed. If it comes to that, he said slowly, I hope to do what's best for the realm, for the living. I know how that sounds, vague and pious. A mirthless laugh escaped him. But the idea of more butchery is sickening. I'd prefer a peace, if it could be reached. Brienne regarded him with an expression he couldn't quite parse. Peace, yes, I suppose we must try. She turned to go, but Jaime found himself speaking again, more softly. Brienne. She glanced back. Yes, he swallowed. I never truly thanked you for saving my hand that day, and my life more than once. He saw the faint flush of color on her cheeks. I know we've never quite... Well, I just wanted you to know. I'm grateful. Her lips parted, forming words slowly. I only did what was right. That's all. She lingered a moment, then pivoted and left him there by the stables, her cloak trailing behind her. Jaime watched her go, feeling the chill wind brush his face, unsure if he'd said too little or too much. In the following days, Jaime found a strange rhythm in Winterfell. He performed small tasks to make himself useful, whether training novices in the yard or coordinating with scouts who patrolled the roads leading south and east. Occasionally, he and Sansa spoke of the broader state of the realm. She seemed open to gleaning what knowledge he had about the politics in King's Landing, but her posture remained guarded, as though she feared to trust him fully. That was fair, he thought. If their positions were reversed, he wouldn't trust himself either. He also found himself in conversation with Davos Seaworth on occasion, the Onion Knight who had served Stannis Baratheon and then joined Jon Snow. Davos lingered in Winterfell, helping with logistics. The man had a weathered face and an easy manner of speech that contrasted sharply with Jaime's dryness. But Davos knew war from all sides, had survived the Blackwater where Stannis had been routed by the Lannisters. Some nights, over a cup of sour northern ale, they would share old war stories. Davos made no secret that he still harbored bitterness over the cunning that had bested Stannis, but he also recognized that Stannis had made his own fatal choices. It's a new world now, Davos said one night by the fire. We've all seen things we never thought possible. Dead men rising, ice demons, dragons in the sky. Hard to cling to old grudges when something like that's outside your walls. Jaime nodded. But men do cling to them all the same. The memory of the Red Wedding, or of the beheading of Ned Stark, or of the burning of the Riverlands. These things don't vanish because we fought the dead together. Davos sighed. Aye, that's so. But maybe enough men of honor remain to forge a different path. We can only hope. He studied Jaime, his gray eyes thoughtful. You fought bravely out there, Lannister. Suppose that's what matters now. Jaime wasn't sure if bravery was what he had displayed, or desperation. Still, he accepted the comment with a faint nod. What do you think becomes of the Iron Throne if Daenerys returns? She has the dragons, after all. Davos's mouth twisted. Hard to say. She lost many men here, but she still has 1 or 2 dragons, far as I know, and she has the loyalty of the Unsullied and Dothraki who survived. That's not an army to scorn. Cersei Lannister will need more than a few walls to keep them at bay. Jaime's gut churned. In the past, he might have believed that Lannister gold, cunning, and well-fortified castles could thwart any invasion. But he'd seen what dragons could do, how they turned the undead ranks to ash in moments. Could King's Landing stand against that? The city had the scorpions Qyburn had devised. Massive crossbows able to wound a dragon, but it felt like a frail hope against the fury of Targaryen fire. Perhaps we can avoid that war, Davos said softly, as though reading Jaime's thoughts. If the North stands aside, and if the rest of the realm sees sense. But we both know how little chance that might have. Jaime gazed into the fire. Yes, he said after a moment. We both do. A hush fell, and they let it linger, each lost in his own ruminations. Winterfell gradually returned to a semblance of order, though the gloom of widespread tragedy never fully lifted. Ravens came and went with tidings from other parts of the north. Some told of scattered white sightings, others brought pleas for food. There were also rumors from the riverlands of outlaws rising up in the chaos, men calling themselves the Brotherhood without banners, or new brigands taking advantage of the lawless stretches. Jaime remembered the region well. He had once been a prisoner at Riverrun, thanks to Robb Stark's cunning. How times changed. Now there was no Robb Stark to hold the Riverlands together. House Fry had been left in shambles after the death of Walder Fry and the condemnation of the Red Wedding. House Tully was scattered, with the Blackfish rumored dead or vanished. Then, one morning, a raven arrived bearing the seal of King's Landing. A lion and a stag conjoined. The news had traveled slowly, but it brought a missive from Queen Regent Cersei Lannister, addressed to Sansa Stark and the Lords of the North. Within, Cersei proclaimed Tommen as rightful king, demanded that the North reaffirm its fealty to the Iron Throne, and invited them to send an envoy to discuss peaceful reintegration of the realm after the war against the dead. Jaime stood by as Maester Wolkan read the letter aloud to Sansa and a handful of other northern lords in Winterfell's smaller council chamber. The Maester's voice reverberated in the stony confines. His Grace King Tommen wishes nothing but harmony for his loyal subjects, especially in these times of great upheaval. Her Grace the Queen Regent has graciously offered a summit in King's Landing to mend old wounds. In exchange, the North shall pledge its loyalty as it once did under the Targaryen kings. A failure to attend shall be viewed as a refusal of the rightful king's authority. The lords stirred uneasily. Lady Mormont, small and fierce, scowled. Lord Glover snorted. Sansa's face remained impassive, though Jaime sensed her tension. She dares to speak of old wounds? Lord Serwyn said bitterly. After what the Lannisters did to our liege lords? A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Sansa raised a hand. Quiet, please. When they settled, she turned to Jaime. You're the only Lannister here, Ser Jaime. What do you make of this? He took a slow breath. Cersei knows the realm is weakened, that the North is battered. She sees an opportunity to reassert Lannister dominance. My guess is that she's worried about Daenerys Targaryen's next move. She'd rather gather every great house to her cause than let them side with the Dragon Queen. So she pretends to offer peace? Lady Mormont said sharply. After the Freys and Boltons cut down the Starks? After the Lannisters marched on the Riverlands time and again? Jaime inclined his head. Yes, that is the gist of it. But King's Landing doesn't have the might it once did. The gold from Highgarden was seized, but the Tyrells remain resentful. The city's population is half-starved. The crown is in debt. Cersei's just as desperate for allies as she is eager to subdue her enemies. Lord Glover spat. The she-wolf of the Red Keep can go hang. We owe her no fealty. Another wave of muttering. Sansa's gaze flicked between them. Perhaps we do not, she said quietly. But if we simply ignore this, we risk another war. We might not have the strength for it. Daenerys Targaryen is out there also claiming the throne. If she marches north and finds us in open defiance, do we risk the Dragonfire as well? There's also the Vale to consider, Lord Royce added. They may counsel moderation. The Knights of the Vale came here to defend Winterfell from the dead, but they remain loyal to House Arryn, not necessarily to House Stark alone. If King's Landing invites a summit, Lord Robert Arryn might be inclined to send an envoy. Sansa studied the letter again, her expression cool. It's likely a trap, but ignoring it might give the Queen Regent reason to label us traitors. Then she'd have an excuse to send an army. And if Daenerys or the Vale or the Riverlands get involved, we're caught in a pincer. She paused, letting the moment stretch. Jaime saw her shoulders tense. She was no longer the timid girl who had once been betrothed to Joffrey, but a leader shouldering enormous burdens. Finally, she turned to her lords. We will respond cautiously. I will not go myself, for I don't trust Cersei that much. But we should send someone to treat with the crown and see what they truly want. Who then? Asked Lord Glover. You need someone you can afford to lose, if the Lannisters decide to behead them. A ripple of grim laughter, but Sansa did not smile. Her eyes drifted across the faces at the table. Then they settled on Jaime. He lifted his brow. "You want me to go?" "It may be that you are the best choice," she said slowly. "You are sworn to the Kingsguard, indeed to King Tommen, if you still hold that vow. You're also not entirely trusted by the North. If anything happens, we can disavow you, or the Lannisters can hold you hostage, but it won't cripple Winterfell's leadership. And if you truly wish to broker peace, you have the best chance of speaking to the Queen Regent." Jaime let out a small, humorless chuckle. "So I'm the ideal expendable envoy. A perfect role for me, wouldn't you say?" Sansa's face remained grave. "I don't want you to come to harm, Ser Jaime, but you have ties in King's Landing, and you understand how Cersei thinks. If there is any chance of forging a lasting peace, or at least a truce until we recover, you might be the one to find it." He realized the logic made sense. The other Northern lords nodded grudgingly. Any Stark envoy would be too risky. Brienne was sworn to Sansa, but sending her could be a blow if Cersei took her captive. Davos might have gone, but he was more loyal to Jon Snow. In truth, Jaime was the only figure who stood between two worlds. "All right," he said finally. "I'll go. On one condition." Sansa tilted her head. "Which is?" He set his jaw. "You extend me the courtesy of traveling with at least a small retinue for safety. And if I return, you'll at least consider my counsel on how to handle whatever demands Cersei makes." Sansa nodded. "Agreed. Ser Brienne can choose a handful of knights or soldiers to accompany you as far as the outskirts of the city, though I won't risk her actually entering King's Landing if it can be avoided. We'll give you our official letter of response, and you can deliver it to the Queen Regent." One of the Northern lords muttered, "We're trusting a Lannister with our words? Next, we'll trust crows with our harvest." Sansa turned a cool stare on him. "If you have a better suggestion, my lord, speak it." He fell silent, shaking his head. The tension in the room remained thick, but no one challenged the plan further. So it was decided. After the meeting, Jaime lingered a moment in the council chamber as the lords filed out, giving him wary glances. Sansa rose from her seat, gathering the letter. She looked exhausted. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know it's not an easy task." He forced a faint smile. "I've faced worse. At least I won't be riding into a horde of whites this time." She nodded, but there was no lightness in her eyes. "Be careful. Cersei is unpredictable. If she means to kill you, she'll find a way. Or if she means to use you, that could be worse." He thought of how Cersei had changed, how the death of her children had twisted her further. Yet Tommen was still alive, and that gave her something to cling to. "I'll do my best to keep my head," he said wryly. Then, after a moment, he said, "Lady Sansa, I know I've said it before, but I truly am sorry for what your family suffered. None of it can be undone, but I am sorry." She studied him, her voice quiet. "Thank you. My family's blood is on many hands, and yours are not the only ones. If you can help spare more families from such tragedy, that might mean something." He nodded gravely. With that, he exited, the echo of her words lingering in his mind. Preparations for the journey south began at once. They secured horses, provisions, and a small escort of 12 men, Northerners and Vale Knights mostly. Sansa also gave him a sealed document bearing her personal sigil, which contained the North's response to Cersei's summons. He didn't ask for details, but suspected it was a cautious acceptance of the parley, with conditions to ensure no immediate subjugation. The day before departure, Jaime stood in the courtyard, checking his horse's tack. Winterfell's stable master was a gruff man who eyed him warily but made no trouble. Nearby, Podrick fussed over a few saddlebags, presumably ensuring that the escort had all they needed. He heard Brienne's footfalls before she spoke. She had a distinctive weight to her step, unhesitating, purposeful. "You're really going," she said, stopping at his side. He turned, running a hand over the horse's mane. "I am." She studied him. "And what do you hope to gain?" He let out a breath. "I'm not entirely sure. Maybe a chance to keep the realm from more war, if it's possible. Or to see what's left of my family." Tommen is still there, after all. Brienne nodded slowly. I know you care for him, no matter how complicated that is. She paused. Cersei won't make this easy. He offered a bitter smirk. Nothing is ever easy with her. Brienne hesitated as if weighing her next words. Will you come back to Winterfell afterward? The question took him by surprise, but he heard genuine concern behind it. That depends on how things go. If I manage to convince Cersei to hold a real summit, perhaps I'll come back with terms. If she tries to kill me, well, that might be that. She frowned. Don't joke about that. He exhaled. All right, then yes, I'll do my best to come back. Unless Sansa Stark and the North prefer me gone. I don't truly belong here, Brienne, but I'm not sure I belong in King's Landing anymore either. Her gaze flickered. For what it's worth, I think you've done some good here these past weeks. People see it, even if they don't wish to admit it. A faint warmth stirred in him. He looked down at her, noticing a small scratch on her cheek that hadn't quite healed from the battle. You'll keep protecting Lady Sansa? Of course, Brienne said. That's my duty. He nodded. Another silence. Then, with a mixture of formality and warmth, he extended his right hand to her, the same hand she'd saved from Locke's blade. Farewell, Sir Brienne. She hesitated, then clasped his forearm. Her grip was strong, her eyes steady. Farewell, Sir Jaime. Keep your word. He nodded, letting go. In that moment, he wished he could say something more, something that might convey the depth of gratitude and sorrow tangled inside him. But words failed, so he simply turned back to the horse, finishing with the bridle. At dawn the next day, the small party assembled in the courtyard. Jaime wore his armor, polished but still showing the scars of the recent battle, and carried his sword at his side. Podrick helped load the final provisions. A cluster of northern men, led by a grizzled sergeant named Hark, would ride with him as an escort until they reached the Trident. Then some would turn back, leaving only a few to continue to King's Landing if all seemed safe enough. Sansa watched from the steps, flanked by Brienne and the northern lords. She offered a short, stately nod as Jaime mounted. The wind whipped a lock of her auburn hair across her face. She wore a dark cloak trimmed in wolf fur, a badge of her station. Jaime dipped his head in return. He could sense the tension. Many in the courtyard stared at him with wary curiosity. The Kingslayer, riding south on a mission of peace, sounded like a riddle. No time for second thoughts, he told himself. With a light nudge, he spurred the horse forward, and the company rode out of Winterfell's gates into the chilly northern morn. The old King's Road stretched before them, flanked by snowy fields and stands of skeletal trees. Jaime spared a backward glance at the castle's gray walls, half expecting Brienne to appear one last time on the ramparts. But he saw only the silhouettes of watchmen, and then the gates receded from view. They made their way south at a measured pace. Over the next few days, the land showed gradual signs of thaw, though winter still clung stubbornly. They encountered a few scattered villages, some deserted, some tentatively reoccupied by survivors. The people recognized the Stark sigil on some of the men's cloaks and allowed them to pass without trouble, though many eyed Jaime's lion with fear or anger. He kept his cloak drawn over it when he could, keenly aware that the realm still held countless grudges against his house. At night, they camped by roadways or in half-ruined inns. The talk around the fires was guarded. The Northerners were polite enough but did not invite Jaime into their confidences. Podrick was the only one who treated him with genuine friendliness, and that was mostly from the habit of once serving Tyrion. Jaime found it ironic that the only real companions he had in this retinue were a squire who revered Brienne and a handful of taciturn men who barely spoke his name. He had much time to brood, letting the clop of hooves and rustle of cloaks fill his ears as the miles slipped by. The road felt eerily empty in places, a sign of how war and the undead had ravaged the land. Occasionally, they spied a family dragging a cart or a group of ragged refugees, all with haunted looks. The long night had touched everyone. Some recognized Jaime's golden hair or the lion on his armor and glowered. Others looked too weary to care. After a week, they began to enter the riverlands. The terrain grew more temperate, the snow thinning. They passed near deserted fields, charred barns, and a few small holdfasts still bearing the scars of earlier conflicts. The Frey sigil was conspicuously absent from many places. Word had spread of Walder Frey's demise and the ignominy of the Red Wedding. In his absence, lesser lords squabbled for control, and outlaws roamed. Jaime had once marched through these lands with Tywin's host, sowing fear. Now he passed more quietly, with only a small escort, carrying a message of truce. The irony was not lost on him. He half expected trouble from the outlaws rumored to plague the area. Some claimed the Brotherhood without banners still roamed about, championing justice for the common folk. But the party encountered only a few watchers from afar, silhouettes that vanished into the undergrowth. Perhaps the outlaws had enough sense not to tangle with an armed band. Eventually, they forded the Red Fork. The crossing was tense. One wrong step on the battered bridge and a horse might plunge into the rushing waters below. But they made it, continuing toward the crossroads where the King's Road split south to King's Landing. It was near that crossroads that half of Jaime's escort prepared to turn back, in keeping with Sansa's instructions. The men had no desire to risk the capital, a place where Lannisters still held sway. Jaime understood. He bid them farewell as they parted ways one cold morning. That left Jaime, Podrick, and 4 other men, 2 from the Vale, 2 from the north, who had volunteered or been chosen to see him safely to the city gates. They were uneasy about it, but the men had grit in them, and probably wanted to see the wonders of the South for themselves. With the escort thus reduced, they pressed on. The road grew more familiar to Jaime in a bittersweet way. These were the same stretches of land he'd ridden countless times at the head of Lannister columns, back when the realm bent to Tywin's might. But it felt different now. The villages near the Crownlands were still reeling from supply shortages. Some grumbled that the Queen in the capital did not care for them. Others refused to open their doors, remembering old horrors. At last, one day, they came in sight of the towering walls of King's Landing. The sight might once have stirred pride in Jaime, but now it only conjured weariness and dread. The city spread along Blackwater Bay, the ramparts and gates manned by gold-cloaked guards. The Red Keep rose on Aegon's high hill, red stone stark against the sky. Smoke from countless chimneys and fires hazed the air overhead. From a distance, the city seemed both grand and haggard, an old lion that refused to die. "Gods," muttered one of the Vale men, a youth named Albar. "It's bigger than I imagined." "Bigger and filthier," Jaime said under his breath. "Welcome to the capital." They rode along the main approach, eventually halted by a company of gold cloaks at the gate. The captain stepped forward, glancing at their northern attire and the lion on Jaime's armor. His gaze flickered in recognition. "Ser Jaime Lannister," he said uncertainly. "You've returned." Jaime nodded, offering a measured smile. "With an envoy from the north, at the Queen's summons." He produced Sansa's sealed letter. "We have no quarrel here, Captain. We come in peace." The captain hesitated, but he knew better than to bar the man once known as the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. "Open the gates," he barked. Then more quietly to Jaime, "Word of your arrival will be sent to the Red Keep at once, my lord." Jaime let out a breath, urging his horse forward as the portcullis rattled upward. Inside, the street was crowded despite the chill. Merchants, beggars, sellswords, small folk, all milling about. The stench of the capital assaulted them. Sweat, manure, rotting refuse. It was as though war and winter had not changed the city's oldest habits. Children ran barefoot among the stalls. Mothers shouted at them to come back, and men haggled over meager produce. Podrick gaped at the chaos. Jaime felt a grim nostalgia. This was the city he'd called home for so long, the heart of Lannister power. Yet it seemed both painfully familiar and strangely foreign. So much had happened since he last set foot here. They made their way up the winding streets toward the Red Keep. The crowd parted when they saw armed riders, though a few recognized Jaime and hissed or muttered curses. Whether for him personally or for the gold cloaks, he couldn't say. He spied a crude drawing of a lion's head on a wall, with a knife through it. perhaps a sign of the city's resentment. At length, they reached the gates of the Red Keep, where Lannister guards in crimson cloaks and gold armor waited. These men were more disciplined than the gold cloaks at the city gate, and they immediately recognized Jaime. Their commander, a tall knight with a stern face, stepped forward. "Sir Jaime, Queen Regent Cersei will wish to see you at once." Jaime nodded. "My companions will need quarters. We also bear a letter from Lady Sansa Stark." The commander eyed the Northerners warily, especially the direwolf sigils. "They'll be given rooms in the keep under guard. Their weapons will be held in the armory until further notice." One of the Northerners bristled, hand dropping to his sword hilt. Jaime raised a hand quickly. "We're guests," he reminded them. "We abide by the city's rules. Let them stow their weapons. You'll come to no harm." Reluctantly, the men handed over their blades. Podrick kept glancing at Jaime, clearly nervous, but Jaime offered him a silent reassurance. They dismounted, stable hands rushed to take the horses, and then Jaime was escorted deeper into the Red Keep. The halls felt oppressive, the same red stone, the same flickering torches. Memories bombarded him. Scenes with Joffrey, with Tyrion, with Cersei, with father. The hush felt more ominous than welcoming. The guards led him to a familiar corridor, ending before the royal audience chamber. Two Kingsguard knights in white cloaks stood outside. Jaime recognized them only dimly. Perhaps they were new appointments. They bowed stiffly, opening the double doors. Inside, the chamber was decorated with Lannister sigils and a few battered Baratheon banners. A dais held the Iron Throne. Seated just before it, in a smaller seat, was Queen Regent Cersei Lannister, clad in black and gold, her golden hair coiled in a severe fashion about her shoulders. She sat upright, awaiting him, her eyes cold as winter. Surrounding her were a handful of courtiers, Qyburn among them, his keen gaze flicking to Jaime with curiosity. A retinue of guards stood behind her, and at her side, in a smaller chair, was King Tommen, only a boy, though he tried to mimic a regal bearing. Jaime stepped forward, heart hammering in his chest at the sight of Cersei and Tommen. This was his family, or what remained of it. The boy turned wide eyes on Jaime, uncertain. Cersei's lips parted slightly. A wave of conflicting emotions played across her face. Relief, anger, something else. "Jaime," she said, and her voice was low, clipped. "So you've finally returned." He bowed stiffly. "I have." He rose, meeting her gaze. "In the name of Lady Sansa Stark, I come to respond to your summons." She leaned back, tapping her fingers on the arm of her chair. "Yes, we received word you were approaching. I trust you have the North's message with you." He reached into his cloak and produced the sealed parchment. A guard stepped forward to take it to Cersei, who broke the seal with a small blade. She began to read. Silence stretched as she scanned the contents. Jaime's chest felt tight. He glanced at Tommen, who looked down at his hands. The boy was older than Jaime recalled, but still clearly young. Soft cheeks, a trembling mouth trying to remain firm. At last, Cersei finished reading. She handed the parchment to Qyburn, who also gave it a quick glance. Then she fixed Jaime with her eyes. A polite reply, full of cautious phrases and half-promises. The North claims it wishes only peace, yet it refuses to acknowledge King Tommen's absolute authority. They speak of negotiation and treaties, as though we must kneel to them. Her voice dripped with scorn. Do they forget that the last time they defied the crown, they lost everything? Jaime swallowed, keeping his tone measured. They have not forgotten, Your Grace, but they are weary of war. They also have reason to distrust the throne after events in the past. He forced a steadiness into his words. They're willing to discuss an alliance, so long as the North retains certain freedoms. Cersei lifted her chin. Freedoms? You mean they want independence without naming it? Preposterous. She turned to Tommen. My king, the North thinks to treat with you as equals. That cannot stand. Tommen nodded uncertainly, but said nothing. Jaime's chest tightened at how the boy was used as a figurehead. Cersei turned back to him. I see Lady Stark didn't deign to come herself. Instead, she sends you. She raised an eyebrow. You, a Lannister, traveling as her envoy. That alone is an insult. I volunteered, Jaime said. She offered me no illusions of trust, but she was willing to let me attempt to speak with you, to see if there's any chance for peace. Cersei's gaze darkened. Peace? Peace for them, while they nurse old grudges and plan who knows what alliances with the Targaryen pretender. That's not peace, Jaime. It's a ploy to stall while they gather strength. She stood, stepping down from her seat. The guards parted to let her approach Jaime directly. He felt her presence keenly as she circled him, her voice dropping to a near hiss. You left me here alone to face the burdens of rule. You left your son without a father. And now you come back as Sansa Stark's mouthpiece. He drew a breath. I left to fight the dead, Cersei. You knew that threat was real. She scoffed. I knew no such thing. As far as I'm concerned, the war in the north was their affair. Let them freeze and die. Yet you abandoned me. Abandoned Tommen. Her eyes flared with anger or hurt. How many times must I be betrayed by those I love? Jaime felt a pang. I never betrayed you, but the realm needed every sword to stand against the Whites. If we hadn't joined forces, all of Westeros might have fallen. Yet here we stand, she snapped, throwing a hand wide. And I see no dead men walking our streets. Did the threat vanish as conveniently as it arose? She gestured dismissively. Perhaps the North exaggerates to cover its own failures. Regardless, you're here now. Her gaze flicked to the rest of the chamber, the Watchers. Leave us, she commanded the courtiers. All of you, except the king, remain outside. Qyburn, you too. They bowed or curtsied, quickly departing, leaving Jaime, Cersei, and Tommen. The boy sank deeper into his chair as if wishing to vanish. Cersei's voice echoed in the hush of the chamber. You have gall, Jaime, she said, stepping closer. Have you forgotten we're the last of the Lannisters that matter? He stood firm, though his heart pounded. I haven't forgotten. I'm here to see if we can avoid another war. He glanced at Tommen, wanting to speak to the boy but uncertain how. My king, you don't want more bloodshed, do you? Tommen's eyes darted between them. And no, Ser Jaime. Of course not. Mother says we must show strength, though, or the realm will fall into chaos. Cersei placed a hand on Tommen's shoulder. Yes, my sweet boy. Strength. Tell me, Jaime, did Lady Stark mention any terms for bending the knee to Tommen? Or was it all demands? She made no demands, Jaime answered quietly. She wrote that the North would prefer self-governance but would remain an ally of the crown in matters of mutual defense. She's also concerned about Daenerys Targaryen's claim. She'd like the crown to negotiate some arrangement that spares the realm another destructive war. Cersei's lips curled. She wants the crown to kneel to Daenerys, no doubt, or to welcome the Dragon Queen into Westeros so she can roast us all. Jaime shook his head. Not kneel, just talk. At least see if the Targaryen can be reasoned with. She fought the dead alongside the living, after all. Cersei let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You sound like a fool, brother. Do you know what it means to let a Targaryen roam free with dragons? It means the moment we show weakness, she burns kings landing to ash. She pointed a finger in Jaime's face. We must crush her before she sets foot inside these walls. He inhaled slowly, trying to remain calm. If you do that, the North will surely side with her. The Vale might follow suit. The Riverlands are in chaos, but the Tyrells might see a chance to ally with Daenerys too. The crown can't fight the entire realm alone, Cersei. She glared. Don't presume to lecture me. We still have allies. House Greyjoy, for one, or what remains of it. There are lords in the Reach who detest the Tyrells. And we have Qyburn's devices to bring down a dragon. We are not as weak as you think. I'll not yield to a Stark girl or a Targaryen pretender. Tommen fidgeted, looking frightened. Jaime addressed him gently. Your Grace, you have a chance to bring peace to a realm so tired of war. Listen to reason, please. So many have died. My father, my nephew, your brother. He thought of Myrcella and Joffrey. More war means more death. Tommen swallowed. I know. I don't want war. He glanced up at Cersei. Mother. She silenced him with a gesture, her eyes still locked on Jaime. You come here with your talk of reason, yet you deserted the city. You speak as if your father's legacy means nothing, as if Tywin Lannister didn't hold the realm together with cunning and might. Her anger was a roiling storm, but Jaime saw something else beneath it. Fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being alone. He softened his voice. I loved father in my own way, but I won't be him, Cersei. I can't. The realm is not the same as it was. We've faced a threat beyond reason. The North is prepared to stand with us if we meet them halfway. If we do, maybe the Targaryen can be reasoned with too. Or maybe she roasts us. That's the chance you'd take. Cersei's lips tightened, and she turned away, pacing. I see you've learned weakness among the Starks, Jaime. How far you've fallen from the man who once pushed a boy from a tower window. The reference to Bran Stark's crippling stung him like a slap. He clenched his teeth, shame flooding him. That was a lifetime ago, he said quietly. Yes, and this is what you are now. A fool who begs for scraps from the North, who sees them as better than us. She spun, eyes blazing. But you're still a Lannister, my brother, the father of my children. Doesn't that mean anything to you? He stared at her, heart pounding. It means I want to see Tommen safe. I want the realm stable. I'm tired of the bloodshed. Aren't you? Her shoulders rose and fell with a sharp breath. She glanced at Tommen, and for a moment her face softened. Then the mask of steel snapped back into place. Tommen will be safe when the North kneels, when the Targaryen threat is ended, and when every lord who defies us is brought to heel. That is the only security. Jaime realized he was losing this argument. Cersei's paranoia ran too deep, her bitterness too entwined with her sense of survival. He swallowed, forcing a last attempt. If the North will not kneel, do you truly plan to march an army there? The crown can barely feed its own people. Where will you find the gold? The men? She arched a brow. I have my ways. Her vagueness worried him more than any direct threat. He shifted tactics. So what do you want me to tell Sansa Stark? That the crown rejects her letter outright? You summoned the North for a parley. Cersei allowed a thin smile. Tell her the crown demands her immediate presence here, or at least a high-ranking northern lord, to swear fealty in Tommen's name. Then, once that's done, we can discuss terms of autonomy within reason. Jaime shook his head. She'll never agree to that. She'd fear being taken hostage. You know that. Let her fear, Cersei hissed. Fear is what keeps people obedient. If she won't come, then we brand her a traitor to the Iron Throne. And if the North stands behind her, they become traitors as well. Tommen flinched. Mother! She turned to him, voice softening only slightly. My sweet king, you must show strength. This is the only way to keep your subjects in line. Tommen faltered under her gaze. Yes, mother, he whispered. Jaime's heart ached for the boy. Aloud he said, if you do this, the North will not come peacefully. They'll turn to Daenerys Targaryen for aid. Then we'll have a war on two fronts. Cersei's grin was almost predatory. Then so be it. I'll see them all burn before I let the Lannisters be undone by a pack of wolves or a clutch of dragons. She gestured to the guards. Take Ser Jaime to his quarters. He is not to leave the Red Keep without my permission. I'll decide what to do with him soon enough. Jaime opened his mouth to protest, but two guards stepped in, polite but firm. He didn't resist. As they escorted him out of the audience chamber, he heard Tommen's voice, small and anxious, fade behind him. He realized with a sinking feeling that his attempt to avert war might only have spurred Cersei to double down on her defiance. So much for peace, he thought bitterly. They led him through winding corridors to a modest suite that once might have belonged to some lesser courtier. The guards stationed themselves outside the door, effectively placing him under house arrest. Exhausted and angry, Jaime paced the room. The window overlooked the city, the narrow streets and distant bay. He wondered where, Podrick and the northern men had been taken. Perhaps Qyburn would amuse himself by questioning them. Or perhaps Cersei would let them cool their heels in the guest quarters. He pressed a hand to his temple. Had he truly believed he could reason with her? The woman who had schemed so relentlessly to hold power, who had lost so many children to war and poison, who had always felt the entire realm was an enemy. She was as she'd always been, only more so, driven by fear and ambition in equal measure, unyielding, dangerous. He thought of the letter Sansa Stark had entrusted him with, the hopes of the North pinned on the possibility of a truce. He had failed. Worse, he might have given Cersei the excuse to brand them traitors. Standing by the window, Jaime gripped the sill. He gazed out at the city he once swore to protect, remembering how he joined the Kingsguard as a youth, brimming with pride, wanting to serve a noble king. He had ended up a Kingslayer, scorned for the one decent thing he ever did, killing Aerys to save 500,000 lives from wildfire. Now, ironically, King's Landing might once again be threatened by a queen who spoke of fire. Only this time it was his own twin sister. Hours passed in that silent room. A servant brought a meal, stale bread, cheese, watered wine, and offered no conversation. Jaime ate distractedly, his mind running in circles. He thought of Tommen, that sweet boy who deserved better than to be a pawn in his mother's power games. And he thought of Tyrion out there somewhere across the sea or wandering the free cities or perhaps in the Targaryen service. Could Tyrion be advising Daenerys, as some rumors claimed? If so, then the confrontation with Cersei was inevitable, and no words from Jaime would deter her. Night fell, and he lit a single candle in the room. Outside, the city's distant lights glittered. The door opened unexpectedly, and in walked Qyburn, wearing his dark robes, hands folded. The guards shut the door behind him. "Ser Jaime," Qyburn said with a chilly smile, "it's been some time. I hear you've returned from your northern sojourn." Jaime eyed him warily. "As you see. Does the Queen send you to interrogate me?" Qyburn's smile did not falter. "Not precisely. Her Grace is considering her options. She wishes me to inform you that you are free to move about the Red Keep, under guard, but not to leave it." He paused. "She also wishes to know if you will pledge your sword to King Tommen once again, in opposition to the Northern Rebellion and the Targaryen Pretender." Jaime barked a hollow laugh. "Is that what she calls it? The Northern Rebellion?" He stared at Qyburn. "And if I refuse to pledge my sword to her madness?" Qyburn tilted his head. "Then she may deem you an enemy. Surely you must recognize how precarious that would be." Jaime clenched his fists. "Tell her I remain Tommen's sworn protector, but that I'll have no part in plunging this realm into another war if it can be avoided." Qyburn studied him with a reptilian calm. "I see. A delicate stance, though her Grace does not care much for delicacy these days. She wonders if your time with the Starks has softened you." "It hasn't softened me," Jaime snapped. "I just don't want thousands more to die." Qyburn nodded, as if filing that information away. "Very well. I shall relay your words. In the meantime, I suggest you remain compliant with the Queen's wishes. She has other means to ensure loyalty if normal persuasion fails." Jaime remembered the rumors of Qyburn's experiments, the monstrous shape of the reanimated Gregor Clegane, the vile secrets that lay in the depths of the Red Keep's dungeons. He stared at the man. "I'm not afraid of your threats." Qyburn bowed with that same disconcerting smile. "They are not my threats, Ser Jaime. I am but a loyal servant to the Queen." With that, he left, the door shutting behind him. Jaime stood there in the flicker of candlelight, anger pounding in his temples. So this was what he had come back to: Cersei, coiled like an adder, ready to strike at any perceived slight. And now she would brand the North traitors if they didn't submit. He wanted to tear the Lannister sigil from his breast, cast aside the last vestiges of House Lannister's cruelty. But that name was entwined with his identity, just as his skill with the sword was entwined with his hand. Perhaps if he had lost that hand, he would have been forced to reinvent himself long ago, become a man who could walk away from Lannister pride without a backward glance. But fate had left him whole, and with that wholeness came the burden of every sin and every vow. He sank onto the bed, resting his head in his hands. He thought of Sansa's face, the quiet hope in her eyes when she asked him to negotiate. He pictured Brienne, her unwavering honesty, the spark of cautious respect she'd shown him. He thought of every face in the north who had begun to accept him, or at least accept his help. Now he was trapped in the city he had once ruled, a guest or prisoner to the Queen Regent. Somewhere in the darkness, a plan began to form, fragile as a spider's thread. He would try again to speak with Tommen alone, try to make the boy see reason. If Tommen would stand up to Cersei, truly stand up as a king, perhaps a compromise could be found. Perhaps that was a fool's hope, but it might be the realm's last. Jaime's hand curled around the hilt of his sword. He had faced the dead in open battle. What was one queen's wrath compared to that? But he knew a mother's desperation was a fearsome thing. If it came down to choosing between the realm and Cersei, he might have to do what he had once done to the Mad King. Could he slay the woman he had loved for so long, if it meant saving thousands? He closed his eyes, a shudder passing through him. Once, he had faced that question with the Mad King and he had answered steel. But with Cersei, everything was tangled in love, shame, history. The dawn might bring answers, or it might bring more darkness. Yet he was Jaime Lannister, still the realm's greatest swordsman, still a man who had once tried to do the right thing and been cursed for it. If fate demanded he choose again, he prayed he would have the strength to do what was necessary, whatever that might be. And so he waited in the gloom of his old home, a lion in a cage, turning the question over and over in his mind, uncertain which choice would damn him more, or whether any choice could save him from the legacy he bore.